The city streets thrummed with life as James Carter moved through them, his polished leather shoes tapping out a steady beat against the cracked pavement. The tailored navy suit he wore hugged his athletic frame, a testament to years of discipline and ambition, its crisp lines reflecting the late amber glow of the setting sun. In his right hand swung a sleek black briefcase, its leather surface catching faint glints of light, while his left pressed a smartphone to his ear. His voice carried a calm authority, each syllable deliberate as he finalized details with a colleague. About tomorrow's high-stakes presentation, numbers danced in his mind, projected profits, timelines. Strategy Essex wasn't just an aspiration for him, it was a lifeline, a hard-earned badge of how far he'd climbed from humble beginnings. The urban symphony of honking horns and distant chatter filled the air, but James barely noticed. His focus remained razor-sharp, his thoughts consumed by the pitch that could elevate his career to new heights. So when the faint crunch of tires crept into his periphery, he dismissed it as background noise until it wasn't. A sudden flash of red and blue pierced the dusk, bouncing off shop windows and halting his stride. The sharp wail of a siren sliced through the evening, and James glanced back, his brow creasing in confusion. A black and white police cruiser loomed behind him, its headlights pinning him like a spotlight. "You in the suit, stop right there." The voice crackled through a megaphone, clipped and commanding, leaving no room for misinterpretation. James froze mid-step, the phone still pressed to his ear. His colleague's voice buzzed faintly, but it was drowned out by the thudding in his chest. Slowly, he lowered the device, his fingers tightening around it as a ripple of unease spread through him. What was this? He hadn't jaywalked, hadn't so much as littered. For a fleeting moment, he considered turning to face them, explaining himself with the same measured tone he used in boardrooms. But something deeper instinct, perhaps, urged him forward. He resumed walking, quicker now, his eyes darting toward the thinning crowd ahead, seeking safety in numbers. "Sir, stop immediately." The voice grew louder, edged with impatience. The siren blared again, a jolt of sound that sent adrenaline surging through his veins. His pulse raced, his polished shoes striking the pavement harder as his walk turned brisk. The city, once a familiar embrace of steel and glass, now felt like a trap closing in. The cruiser's engine growled as it matched his pace, its presence inescapable. "Stop where you are, or we will engage." The words slammed into him, heavy and final. James's breath hitched. Around him, curious onlookers slowed their steps, their stares prickling his skin like needles. He hesitated, his mind spinning. Running would brand him guilty. Innocence was a luxury rarely afforded in moments like this. But standing still might invite worse. The cruiser screeched to a halt, and two officers emerged, their boots grinding against the asphalt. The taller one, his face carved with stern lines, kept a hand near his holster, his posture radiating authority. "Hands where we can see them," he barked, his voice rebounding off the brick facades. James raised his palms instinctively, open and empty, a gesture of surrender he never imagined he'd need. "Officers, there must be some mistake," he said, forcing steadiness into his tone despite the anxiety clawing at his chest. "I'm just heading home from work." The shorter officer, weary and sharp-eyed, stepped closer, his stance taut with suspicion. "We gotta report suspicious individual matching your description. You fit the profile." James frowned, confusion overtaking his initial fear. "Profile? What profile?" His voice sharpened with disbelief. "I've done nothing wrong. I'm on my way home." The taller officer cut him off, his tone flat and unyielding. "Keep your hands where they are." "What's in the bag?" James blinked, caught off guard. "It's a briefcase," he replied, his words tightening. "Papers, files, work stuff, that's all." "Open it," the shorter officer demanded, edging closer. The air thickened with tension, every movement magnified under their scrutiny. James's mind flickered to the stories he'd heard, encounters spiraling out of control, lives upended in seconds. "With all due respect," he said, his voice low but resolute, "I haven't done anything to justify this. I'll cooperate. But I deserve to know why I'm being stopped." His plea hung unanswered. The officers exchanged a glance, a silent agreement passing between them. "Let's not make this harder than it needs to be," the shorter one snapped. "Put the bag down. Hands on your head." James's breath quickened, the command striking him like a physical blow. He opened his mouth to argue, then stopped. Escalation wasn't an option. Slowly, he set the briefcase down, its thud against the pavement echoing in his ears. With a deep, steadying breath, he laced his fingers behind his head, the posture foreign and humiliating. The shorter officer moved fast, seizing James's arm and twisting it back. Cold metal bit into his wrists as handcuffs snapped shut. "Wait, what's this for?" James's voice rose, alarm breaking through his composure. The growing crowd phones aloft, eyes wittingly deepened the sting. Resisting lawful commands, the taller officer replied curtly, "You're coming with us." "I didn't resist," James protested, frustration shattering his calm. "I did everything you asked." His words fell flat, ignored as the officers gripped his arms and marched him toward the cruiser. The world tilted, humiliation warring with disbelief. This couldn't be real. Not him. Not after all he'd built. As they shoved him into the back seat, he glimpsed the onlookers, a blur of faces, some shocked, some pitying, a few simmering with anger. Shame burned his cheeks, but beneath it, a fiercer resolve took root. Inside the cruiser, the taller officer Walker, according to his name tag, loomed over him. His expression unreadable. "Let's start with your ID," he demanded, his tone a blade. James nodded, swallowing his pride. "It's in my jacket pocket." "May I reach for it?" Walker's eyes flicked to his partner, a younger officer named Harris, who lingered near the door, his face betraying a flicker of unease. "Go ahead," Walker said, his hand hovering near his weapon, watching James like a hawk. With deliberate care, James retrieved his wallet and handed over his license. Walker studied it, his lips curling into a faint sneer. "James Carter. Lives uptown, huh? What are you doing down here this late, Mr. Carter?" The skepticism in his voice was palpable. "Walking home from work," James replied evenly. "Late meeting. Is that a problem?" Walker's eyes narrowed. "We gotta report suspicious individual. Matches you." James's frown deepened. "Suspicious how? I'm a professional on a public street. That's not a crime." "Watch your tone," Walker snapped, straightening. "You're a black man in a suit, carrying a briefcase, pacing like you don't belong. That's enough for us." James stiffened, his jaw clenching as the weight of those words sank in. Harris shifted, his discomfort plain. "Sir, if you've got nothing to hide, this'll be quick. Just cooperate." James met his gaze, his frustration simmering. "I am cooperating. But I've done nothing wrong, and you're treating me like a suspect." Walker chuckled, a dry, hollow sound. "Yeah, that's what they all say. Open the briefcase." James hesitated, his patience fraying. "You have my ID. You know who I am. Why open the damn briefcase?" Walker's voice rose, cutting through the cramped space. "Or are you hiding something?" James exhaled sharply. "No, I'm not. But this is harassment. I've explained myself, and you're still acting like I'm a threat. Is this how you uphold justice?" The question hung heavy, unanswered. Walker's smirk faded, replaced by a cold glare. Harris looked away, his fingers twitching nervously. For James, the moment crystallized a bitter truth. Power, unchecked, could twist justice into a weapon. And as the cuffs dug deeper into his wrists, he vowed silently that this injustice wouldn't be the end of his story, but the beginning of a reckoning. The late afternoon sun hung low, casting long shadows across the cracked pavement where a small crowd had gathered. Their voices buzzed like a hive, a mix of curiosity and unease rippling through them as they watched the scene unfold. Some stood with arms crossed, whispering to one another, while others fumbled with their phones, their shaky hands struggling to capture every second of the escalating tension. The air felt thick, charged with anticipation, as all eyes locked onto the confrontation playing out before them. Officer Walker's boots thudded against the ground as he advanced toward James, his broad frame cutting an imposing silhouette against the fading light. "All right, that's enough," he growled, his voice low and gravelly. Carrying the weight of authority he wielded like a blunt instrument, his eyes narrowed, glinting with a cold, unyielding resolve as he loomed closer. "Turn around. Hands behind your back." James froze, his breath catching in his chest as disbelief crashed over him like a tidal wave. His heart pounded, a frantic rhythm against his ribs, as he stared into Walker's stern, unblinking gaze. "What?" he managed, his voice trembling slightly not from fear, but from the sheer absurdity of the demand. "On what grounds?" The question hung in the air, sharp and defiant. As his mind raced to make sense of the moment, he hadn't done anything wrong, hadn't even raised his voice until now, and yet here he was, pinned under the weight of an accusation he couldn't comprehend. Walker's expression didn't flicker. "You're resisting lawful commands," he said flatly, his tone devoid of warmth or hesitation. He took another step forward, closing the gap between them, his shadow swallowing James whole. "And now you're obstructing an investigation." The words landed like blows, each one heavier than the last, as if they were carefully rehearsed to justify whatever came next. James's fists clenched at his sides, his nails digging into his palms as a surge of anger flared within him. "This isn't an investigation," he shot back, his voice rising with a mix of frustration and incredulity. "It's profiling." He could feel the heat creeping up his neck, his pulse thundering in his ears as he locked eyes with Walker. "I haven't done anything illegal, and you know it." The accusation lingered, raw and unfiltered, a desperate plea for reason in a moment that felt stripped of it. Beside Walker, Officer Harris shifted uncomfortably, his boots scuffing the pavement as his gaze darted between the two men. His brow furrowed, a flicker of doubt clouding his usually steady demeanor. "Maybe we should," he started, his voice softer, tinged with uncertainty as he reached for some semblance of calm amid the storm. Walker cut him off with a sharp glare, his head snapping toward Harris like a predator sizing up its prey. "You've got a problem, Harris." The question was a warning, laced with an edge that made it clear dissent wasn't an option. Harris swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing as he straightened under Walker's scrutiny. "No, sir," he replied quickly, his voice subdued, almost mechanical, but his eyes betrayed him flickering with unease. They darted back to James for a fleeting second before dropping to the ground. Walker turned his attention back to James, his patience visibly fraying. "Last chance," he said, his tone clipped and final. "Hands behind your back." The command was a brick wall, unyielding and absolute, leaving no room for negotiation. James's mind spun, a chaotic whirlwind of emotions crashing against one another: anger, fear, humiliation, defiance. He could see the tension in Walker's squared shoulders, the barely restrained aggression simmering in his clenched jaw and narrowed eyes. Every instinct screamed at him to push back, to demand answers, to refuse this injustice outright. But the reality of the situation settled over him like a suffocating fog. Resisting further would only tighten the noose. His chest heaved with a deep, shaky breath as he made his choice. Slowly, deliberately, he turned around, his shoulders stiff with suppressed rage, his pride bruised but unbroken. Walker didn't hesitate. He seized James's wrists with a rough grip, yanking them downward with a force that sent a jolt of pain shooting up James's arms. The handcuffs snapped into place with a harsh, metallic click that reverberated through the air, a sound so sharp it silenced the murmurs of the crowd for a heartbeat. A collective gasp followed, a wave of shock rippling through the onlookers as they processed the sight of a man shackled, for no apparent reason. "This is outrageous," James hissed through gritted teeth, his voice trembling with fury as the cold steel bit into his skin. "I'm being treated like a criminal for no reason." The words spilled out, raw and unfiltered, as he struggled to keep his composure under the weight of his humiliation. "Save it," Walker muttered dismissively, his grip tightening as he shoved James toward the patrol car parked a few feet away. The push was deliberate, a flex of power that sent James stumbling forward, his sneakers scuffing against the pavement. "You're lucky we're not taking this further." As they moved, James's eyes caught a fleeting glimpse of a young woman standing among the crowd. Her phone was raised, steady in her hands despite the chaos, recording every second of his ordeal. Her face was a storm of emotion slips pressed into a tight line of outrage, eyes wide with a mix of pity and defiance. For a brief moment, their gazes locked, and James felt a flicker of something: gratitude, perhaps, or hope that someone was bearing witness to this travesty. He forced his chin up, refusing to let the shame bow his head, even as it gnawed at him from within. Harris trailed behind, his steps slower, more deliberate. He reached the patrol car first and opened the back door, His movements mechanical, but his expression conflicted. "Watch your head," he said softly, almost apologetically, as Walker pushed James inside with a roughness that made the words feel hollow. The door slammed shut with a resounding bang, the sound echoing like a gavel's strike, sealing James's fate for the moment. Walker turned to the crowd, his broad chest puffed out as he waved a dismissive hand. "All right, folks, nothing to see here. Move along." His voice was loud, authoritative, but it couldn't drown out the rising tide of murmurs. A few voices broke through the hum-sharp, indignant protests that pierced the air. "This is ridiculous," a woman shouted, her tone thick with frustration. "What did he even do?" A man added, his words dripping with disdain as he shook his head. The officers ignored them. Walker slid into the driver's seat with a grunt, starting the engine with a loud growl that drowned out the crowd's unrest. Harris climbed in beside him, his hands fidgeting as he adjusted the radio, his fingers twitching with nervous energy. The cruiser lurched forward, pulling away from the scene and leaving the stunned onlookers in its wake. In the back seat, James stared out the window, his reflection fractured by the metal bars that separated him from the front. His cuffed hands rested awkwardly in his lap, the steel cutting into his wrists with every slight movement. A storm brewed within him. Anger roared like thunder, disbelief crackled like lightning, and humiliation weighed on him like a heavy rain. But beneath it all, a fire burned, fierce and unyielding. This wasn't just about him, it was about every person who'd faced the same indignity. Every soul unjustly targeted, every life diminished by the abuse of power. The lesson was searing itself into his soul. Justice wasn't guaranteed, it had to be fought for, demanded, carved out of the chaos by those brave enough to stand against it. The ride was silent at first, save for the static crackle of the police radio, spitting out disjointed bursts of chatter. James's thoughts churned, a relentless tide of questions and resolutions. He took a steadying breath, forcing himself to focus despite the chaos in his mind. "This isn't going to end here," he muttered under his breath, the words a quiet vow to himself. Harris glanced back at him through the rearview mirror, his brow creasing with something that might have been concern. "Look," he said hesitantly, his voice low and tentative, "if this is some misunderstanding, it'll get sorted out." The offer felt fragile, a thin thread of reassurance in a tangle of uncertainty. James's eyes met his, sharp and unflinching. "You think this is a misunderstanding?" His voice was calm, but it cut like a blade, honed by the weight of his experience. "This is a pattern. You know it, and I know it." The accusation hung between them, heavy and undeniable, a truth neither could fully escape. Harris looked away, his grip tightening on the edge of his seat until his knuckles whitened. Walker, meanwhile, smirked a slow, crooked twist of his lips that oozed contempt. "Keep talking, Carter," he said, his tone mocking as he kept his eyes on the road. "Let's see how far that attitude gets you." James didn't respond. He wouldn't give Walker the satisfaction of a reaction. Instead, he turned his gaze back to the window, watching the familiar streets of the city blur past in streaks of color and light. The humiliation simmered beneath his calm exterior, a bitter undercurrent he couldn't shake. But alongside it grew a steely resolve, a determination to turn this moment into something more, a testament, a rallying cry, a reckoning for those who abused their power and assumed they'd face no consequences. When the cruiser pulled into the station, it jolted to a stop with a screech of tires against asphalt. Walker climbed out first, slamming his door shut with a force that rattled the frame. He yanked James's door open with equal aggression, barking, "Out." James slid from the seat, his movements slow and constrained by the cuffs, his dignity battered but intact. Harris stepped forward, reaching out as if to steady him, but Walker waved him off with a sharp, "I've got it." His tone was a snarl, a clear dismissal of Harris's hesitation. The station loomed ahead, its concrete facade stark and uninviting under the harsh glow of fluorescent lights. James glanced at it, then back at the officers, his voice steady despite the weight of the moment. "Is this where you process your mistakes?" The question was quiet, laced with defiance, a subtle challenge that hung in the air like smoke. Walker's jaw clenched, a muscle ticking beneath his skin, but he didn't take the bait. "Keep moving," he ordered, shoving James forward with a rough hand on his shoulder. As they stepped inside, the air grew colder, the sterile scent of disinfectant mingling with the faint hum of voices. Passing officers cast fleeting glances at Jameson, curious, others indifferent. One muttered under his breath, another one of those types, his words dripping with casual prejudice that stoked the fire in James's chest. He swallowed it down, his face a mask of control, refusing to let them see the anger clawing at him. The processing was a cold, mechanical blur. His belongings were confiscated: keys, wallet, phone, each item stripped away like a piece of his identity. His fingerprints were scanned, the machines beep a harsh punctuation to his silence. His photo was snapped, the flash blinding him for a moment as he stared straight ahead, unyielding. No one offered an explanation, and no one seemed to care. Through it all, James kept his head high, his spirit bruised but unbroken, a quiet rebellion against the indignity threatening to swallow him whole. Harris lingered nearby, his discomfort growing more palpable with every step of the process. His hands fidgeted at his sides, his eyes darting between James and the other officers. At one point, he stepped closer to Walker, his voice hushed but urgent. "Look, I still think we should check." "Drop it, Harris," Walker barked, his voice echoing off the tiled walls. "You're starting to sound soft." The reprimand was sharp, cutting through the air like a whip, and Harris recoiled slightly, his shoulders slumping in defeat. James watched the exchange, noting the fracture between the two men. Walker was a wall-bending, unfeeling, a man drunk on the power his badge afforded him. Harris, though, was different. His unease, his hesitation, hinted at a conscience buried beneath the uniform, a flicker of doubt that might one day grow into something more. It wasn't much, but it was enough to plant a seed of hope in James's mind. When the processing was complete, they escorted him to a holding cell. The door clanged shut behind him, the sound reverberating through the small, sterile space like a thunderclap. He sat on the cold metal bench, his back straight, his hands still cuffed in his lap. The walls were bare, the air heavy with the weight of countless untold stories. Through the bars, he could hear the murmur of voice officers chatting, a burst of laughter, the hum of life carrying on as if nothing had happened. But something had happened. An injustice had taken root, and James felt it in his bones. He closed his eyes, taking a deep breath to steady himself. This wasn't the end, it was the beginning. He would endure this, not because it was fair, but because it was necessary. The abuse of power he'd faced wasn't an anomaly, it was a symptom of a deeper rot. A lesson in the fragility of justice when those meant to uphold it wielded it as a weapon instead. When the time came, he'd make sure the world knew what had happened here, not just for himself, but for every voice silenced, every life diminished by the same hands. The consequences of this day would ripple outward, a warning to those who believed their authority was untouchable. Meanwhile, miles away, Clara Evans sat at her desk, her fingers drumming an anxious rhythm against the keyboard. The clock on the wall ticked past 9:15 p.m., each second stretching her nerves thinner. James was never late, never unresponsive. They'd planned a call to finalize tomorrow's board meeting presentation, but he hadn't shown up, and her texts had vanished into a void of silence. Her stomach twisted with unease, a gnawing worry she couldn't shake. Something was wrong, terribly, unmistakably wrong, and she wouldn't rest until she found out what it was. Clara reached for her phone once more, her fingers trembling slightly as she punched in James's number. The call cut straight to voicemail, his familiar greeting echoing hollowly in her ear. She frowned deeply, her teeth sinking into her lower lip as unease coiled in her chest. James wasn't the kind of man to vanish into silence like this. No text, no call, no explanation. Something felt wrong, terribly wrong, and the instinct gnawing at her gut wouldn't let it go. She swiped through her phone with purpose, pulling up her email and calendar, her eyes scanning James's meticulously organized schedule. His last meeting had been at 7:30 p.m., just a few blocks from their downtown officia routine appointment with a city official. Nothing out of the ordinary. By now, he should have checked in with her. It was their unspoken ritual after late nights like this. A wave of urgency crashed over her, sharp and unrelenting. She snatched her coat from the back of her chair and slung her bag over her shoulder, her movements quick and decisive. This wasn't like him at all. Her thumb hovered over the tracking app James had insisted they both install months ago. His cautious nature at work, always preparing for the worst. Clara hesitated, a flicker of guilt tightening her throat. Peering into his whereabouts felt like a betrayal, a breach of the trust they'd built over years of working side by side. But the worry clawing at her insides drowned out the doubt. She tapped the icon, and the screen blinked to life, a tiny dot pulsing on the map. Her breath caught as the location registered. The local police station. The police station? She whispered, her voice trembling with disbelief. Confusion spiraled into full-blown alarm, her heart thudding against her ribcage. Without another thought, she bolted from the office, her phone gripped so tightly her knuckles whitened. The city streets blurred past her as she sped toward the precinct, the cold night air biting at her cheeks. 15 minutes later, Clara burst through the precinct's heavy glass doors, her heels striking the tiled floor with a staccato rhythm that echoed through the sterile space. The air inside was thick with the bitter scent of burnt coffee and the undercurrent of human strain. Overworked officers, restless detainees, a system creaking under its own weight. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a harsh, unflattering glow over the room. Low murmurs of conversation mingled with the clatter of ancient keyboards, a chaotic hum that did little to mask the tension hanging in the air. Clara strode to the front desk, her posture rigid with resolve, though her stomach churned with a mix of dread and frustration. "Excuse me," she said, her voice steady but edged with authority. "I'm here about James Carter. He was brought in earlier tonight." The desk officer, a weary man in his 50s with thinning hair and a permanent slouch, didn't bother lifting his eyes from his flickering computer screen. "And you are," he muttered, his tone flat, as if her presence were just another inconvenience in a long night. "I'm his assistant," Clara replied, folding her arms. "I need to know why he's here." The officer finally glanced up, his bored expression unchanging, as though he'd heard this story 1,000 times before. "Assistant? Huh, well, sorry, miss, but we don't let just anyone back there. You'll have to wait." Clara squared her shoulders, her patience fraying. "Wait for what? I know he's already tracked his phone. I'm not leaving until I see him." The officer sighed, leaning back in his chair with a groan of disinterest. "Look, if he's in custody, there's a reason. Come back tomorrow." "That's not good enough," Clara snapped, her voice rising, sharp enough to cut through the room's dull buzz. "Do you even know who he is? He's not some nobody you can just toss aside as a respected professional. And you're making a colossal mistake." Her words drew the attention of another officer nearby, a stocky man with a weathered face and a no-nonsense demeanor. He ambled over, his boots scuffing the tiles. "What's the problem here?" he asked, his gruff voice carrying a hint of irritation. Clara turned to him, her eyes blazing. "James Carter was arrested tonight, and I want to know why. I demand to see him." The officer crossed his arms, his stance immovable. "We don't owe you anything, lady. If he's here, it's because he broke the law." Clara's composure teetered on the edge, but she forced herself to breathe, her mind racing for leverage. "Listen to me," she said, her tone dropping to a cold, deliberate cadence. "James Carter is the newly appointed director of public safety for the city. If you don't let me see him or at least tell me why he's being held, I'll make sure this entire precinct faces the consequences by morning." The officer's brow lifted, a flicker of surprise breaking through his stony facade. "Public safety director? That's a bold claim." He glanced at the desk officer, who shrugged lazily. "Could be true. I don't know." Clara seized the opening, yanking a folder from her bag with a flourish. "It is true, and I have the proof right here," she said, thrusting the documents forward. James's appointment letter, his credentials, all pristine and official. The second officer raised a hand, cutting her off. "All right, calm down. Let me check on this." He disappeared into the labyrinth of the precinct's back rooms, leaving Clara standing there, her pulse hammering in her ears. The desk officer smirked, leaning back further in his chair. "You're a real bulldog, aren't you?" he said, his voice dripping with condescension. Clara met his gaze, unflinching. "You have no idea." Minutes later, the second officer returned, his face a mask of neutrality. "He's in a holding cell. No, you can't see him tonight. Come back tomorrow." Clara's jaw tightened, her fists clenching at her sides. So you've locked him up without cause, and now you're denying access. Do you realize how this looks? The officer shrugged, defensive. Not my call. Rules are rules. She opened her mouth to argue, but the exhaustion of the night off the fight stopped her short. She knew she'd hit a brick wall, at least for now. Fine, she hissed, her voice laced with venom. But you'd better be ready to justify this to a judge tomorrow. She spun on her heel and stormed out, the cool night air hitting her like a slap as she stepped onto the sidewalk. Her mind churned with outrage. Jims didn't deserve this, and she wouldn't let it stand. She dialed her contact at their legal firm, her fingers shaking with adrenaline. Laura, it's Clara. James has been detained tonight. I need you to pull together everything for a court appearance tomorrow morning. This can't wait. She ended the call, her grip on the phone so tight it hurt. Tomorrow, she'd make sure James's voice cut through the silence they'd forced on him. The system might have flexed its muscle tonight, but she'd see it bend by morning. Back at her apartment, the clock ticked toward midnight as Clara spread out her arsenal on the dining table. James' appointment letter, his spotless resume, letters of commendation from city leaders. Each document was a testament to the man he was, a shield against whatever baseless accusations they'd thrown at him. She pored over every word, her eyes burning with fatigue, but her resolve unyielding. The officers' dismissive sneers replayed in her mind, their refusal to see beyond their own petty authority stoking her anger anew. James had spent his life fighting for fairness, and now he was caught in the jaws of an unjust machine. She wouldn't sleep until she'd pried him free. As dawn crept through her window, painting the room in soft gold, Clara stood ready, suit pressed, files in hand, her determination a blade honed sharp. Justice wasn't just a word to her, it was a promise she'd keep. Meanwhile, miles away, the clang of a metal door reverberated through the precinct's underbelly as James was shoved into a holding cell. The officer escorting him, a weary man with a pinched face, didn't spare him a word. Just a fleeting glance of indifference before the door slammed shut with a jarring finality. James stood frozen for a moment, his breath shallow as he took in the suffocating reality of his new confines. The cell was a cramped box of cold concrete, its walls streaked with grime and despair. A lone metal bench protruded from the wall, its surface scarred with scratches and smeared with stains that told stories he didn't want to imagine. Overhead, fluorescent lights hummed incessantly, their harsh glare amplifying the filth beneath his feet. The air hung heavy, stale with the mingled odors of sweat, fear, and resignation. He exhaled slowly, lowering himself onto the bench, his cuffed hands resting awkwardly in his lap. His shoulders throbbed with tension, but he squared them defiantly, refusing to let this place strip him of his pride. His mind was a tempest anger, confusion, and a desperate need for clarity swirling together. How had it come to this? Hours ago, he'd been shaking hands with council members, discussing budgets and safety reforms. Now he was here, reduced to a number in a system he'd sworn to improve. This is temporary, he murmured to himself, his voice a faint thread in the oppressive silence. Just get through the night. A low, mocking chuckle broke his reverie, and he turned to see a figure slumped in the corner, a weary man with a tangle of greasy hair, and a grin that gleamed with malice. Well, the man drawled, his voice thick with amusement. Look at Mr. Fancy Suit. What did they nab you for? Stealing too much caviar. James kept his gaze steady, his face a mask of calm. He wasn't here to play games, not with this man, not tonight. The stranger leaned forward, his grin stretching wider, predatory. What too good to talk to me, or just scared? Those shiny shoes don't mean squat in here, pal. James drew a slow breath, his mother's voice surfacing through the noisy, a gentle but ironclad mantra from his childhood. Hold your dignity. No matter what, don't let them see you crack. He met the man's eyes, his tone even. I'm not here to fight, just trying to make it through, same as you. The man snorted, flopping back against the wall. Through the night, huh? You don't get it, do you? They've already sized you up, fancy words. Straight spine, all of it. To them, you're just meat for the grinder. The words stung, slicing into the doubts James fought to suppress. He turned away, fixing his stare on a patch of peeling paint, its edges curling like a sneer. He wouldn't bite, wouldn't let the stranger's venom take root. But the man's taunts lingered, threading through James's thoughts like a persistent weed. He'd clawed his way up from nothing past the sidelong glances, the whispered assumptions, the ceilings built to keep him down. He'd earned every title, every handshake, every ounce of respect. Yet here he was, caged and powerless, his identity stripped to a mugshot and a charge he didn't even understand. His jaw tightened, his eyes squeezing shut as he wrestled the rising tide of frustration. This isn't about what they see, he told himself fiercely. It's about who you are. The hours dragged on, the lights never dimming, the air growing denser with every passing minute. He shifted on the bench, the cold metal biting into his bones, but he held his head high. Outside, Clara was fighting for him. He could feel it in his gut. And inside, he'd fight too. Not with fists or shouts, but with the quiet, unyielding strength that had carried him this far. Back at the precinct's front desk, the middle-aged officer, his name tag reading Daniels, watched Clara's retreating figure. With a mix of irritation and grudging respect, he'd seen plenty of people storm in with demands, but there was something about her fire that stuck with him. He scratched at his receding hairline, muttering to his colleague, "She's gonna be trouble tomorrow." The gruff officer, whose name was Harris, grunted in agreement. His arms still crossed from their standoff. "If that guy's really who she says, we're in for a hell of a morning." Daniels smirked, but there was unease in his eyes. Power didn't bend easily, but it could break, and Clara's resolve hinted at a reckoning neither of them could ignore. For James, for Clara, and even for these jaded men, the lesson was dawning. Justice wasn't a gift bestowed by those in charge. It was a flame tended by those brave enough to demand it, and its light revealed the rot of misused authority in stark, unflinching detail. The cold metal bench bit into James Carter's stiff frame, its unyielding surface a cruel companion to the awkward twist of his wrists. Bound tight by the cuffs, every muscle in his body ached, screaming for relief, but sleep remained a distant dream. His mind churned relentlessly, a storm of thoughts swirling in the dim, flickering light of the cell. Beyond the thick steel bars, the hollow echo of footsteps reverberated through the concrete halls, a sporadic rhythm that tugged at his frayed nerves. Distant voices murmured faintly, too muffled to discern, yet sharp enough to pierce the oppressive silence. He wondered about Clara. What was she doing in this very moment? The thought of her sitting still, helpless, was unimaginable. No, she'd be pacing, plotting, her fierce spirit already weaving a strategy to pull him from this nightmare. That image, her resolve burning bright, wrapped around him like a fragile thread of warmth in the chill of his confinement. The quiet shattered once more as the heavy tread of a guard approached. James lifted his head, his neck stiff from hours of strain, and caught sight of the man pausing just outside the cell. The guard's silhouette loomed in the faint glow of the overhead bulb, his face shadowed, but his eyes glinting as they locked with James's for a fleeting second. There was no recognition, no softening, just a cold, fleeting appraisal before the guard turned away. The jingle of keys dangling from his belt clinked like a mocking chime. As he vanished down the corridor, James let out a slow breath, the air escaping his lungs in a shaky plume as he slumped back against the rough wall. His thoughts spiraled back to the night before, replaying every jagged detail, the officers' barking voices laced with disdain, the crowd's phones flashing like judgmental eyes, the weight of their assumptions pressing down on him. Anger flared hot in his chest, a wildfire threatening to consume him, but he wrestled it down with a force of will. Rage was a luxury he couldn't afford it here, not now. Focus was his only lifeline. From the shadowed corner of the cell, a voice rasped again, softer this time, cutting through the haze of his thoughts. "You really think you're walking out of this spotless, don't you?" The man's tone carried a bitter edge, tinged with something like pity. James turned his head, his face a mask of guarded calm, and met the stranger's sunken eyes. "I'm getting out because I didn't do anything wrong," he replied, his voice low but firm, each word a quiet defiance. The man barked a dry, hollow laugh that echoed off the walls. "Doesn't matter what you did, kid. It's about what they think you did. And trust me, they always see the worst." The words hung heavy in the air, a grim prophecy James couldn't ignore. He didn't answer, just leaned forward, elbows digging into his knees. feeling the truth of it settle into his bones, but he wouldn't let it define him, not yet. Hours bled into one another, the night stretching endlessly until exhaustion finally clawed its way through his defenses. In the early morning gloom, James's eyes fluttered shut, his sleep shallow and restless, haunted by the clang of slamming doors and the sharp shouts of guards barking orders. When he stirred awake, a faint sliver of dawn crept through the high, barred window, painting the cell in a pale, ghostly light. The sound of boots thudding closer snapped him upright, his pulse quickening. A guard appeared, his broad frame filling the doorway as he fumbled with the lock, the key turning with a practiced, indifferent twist. "Carter," the guard growled, his voice rough as gravel. "You've got a visitor." James rose, his legs protesting with every stiff movement, and followed the man out into the corridor. His mind raced, a whirlwind of questions and fragile hope. A visitor this early? It could only be Clara, her tenacity cutting through the dawn like a blade. As he stepped into the dim passageway, a spark flickered in his chest. She was here. She wouldn't let this travesty stand unchallenged. Meanwhile, the courtroom hummed with restless energy, a low buzz of whispers rippling through the air as Clara Evans shoved open the heavy double doors. Her heels struck the polished floor with a sharp, determined click, each step a declaration of intent. Heads swiveled, eyes narrowing as they took in her unwavering stride, but she didn't flinch. Her jaw was set, her hands clutching a thick stack of documents like a warrior wielding a shield. She was here to rewrite the narrative, to drag the truth into the light. Judge Harrison, a man in his 50s with a stern, weathered face and a reputation for cutting through nonsense, peered down from his bench. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice clipped, irritation flashing in his eyes. "The session hasn't even started." Clara didn't waver. "Your Honor, my name is Clara Evans. I represent James Carter, a man this court is holding without cause. I have evidence here, proof of his identity and his role as the newly appointed Director of Public Safety for the city." Her words landed like a thunderclap, silencing the room. Even the rustle of papers stilled as the weight of her claim sank in. The prosecutor, Randall, a weary man in his 40s with sharp features and sharper ambitions, adjusted his glasses, his brow creasing in unease. Beside him, Officer Walker stiffened, his face draining of color as if the air had been sucked from his lungs. Judge Harrison's eyebrow arched, skepticism dripping from his tone. "Director of Public Safety, that's a bold assertion." Approached the bench. Clara stepped forward, her movements deliberate, and handed over the meticulously organized file. "This includes his appointment letter, his credentials, and evidence of his standing," she said, her voice steady as steel. "He's not some vagrant snatched off the street, Your Honor. He's a public servant committed to this city's betterment. Last night's arrest was a grotesque abuse of power." The judge flipped through the pages, his expression hardening as the reality unfolded before him. The courtroom felt smaller, the air thicker, as the stakes climbed higher. Randall cleared his throat, stepping forward with forced confidence. "Your Honor, even if these documents hold up, the officers acted on a credible report of suspicious behavior. They had cause to detain him." Clara whirled to face him, her gaze piercing. "Cause based on what? His clothes, his skin, walking down a public street? That's not cause, if that's prejudice." Randall's frown deepened, but she pressed on, relentless. James complied fully, yet they branded him guilty from the jump. Those officers didn't bother with diligence, they leapt to conclusions. And now they're scrambling to cover their tracks. Walker shifted, his boots scuffing the floor, his eyes darting to Randall for rescue. The prosecutor straightened, grasping for control. "Your Honor, the officers acted in good faith. They couldn't have known who he was." Clara's voice rose, slicing through his excuse. "That's the crux of it. They didn't know because they didn't care to find out. They assumed the worst and turned a routine encounter into a fiasco. That's not good faith. It's reckless incompetence." The room crackled with tension, every eye locked on the unfolding clash. Judge Harrison leaned back, his fingers tented, his gaze shifting to Walker. "Officer, step forward," he said, his tone sudden and sharp. Walker hesitated, then shuffled toward the bench, his shoulders hunched. "Yes, Your Honor," he mumbled. "Is it true you detained Mr. Carter without confirming who he was?" Harrison pressed. Walker's mouth opened, then closed, his Adam's apple bobbing as he swallowed hard. He glanced at Randall, who offered a faint nod, but the lifeline was thin. We acted on a report. He stammered. We thought we had probable cause. Clara's voice cut in, crisp and unforgiving. Thought, so you moved on guesswork, not facts. Walker's jaw clenched, his hands balling at his sides. We followed protocol, he muttered. Protocol? Clara shot back. What protocol justifies treating an innocent man like a threat just for existing? Harrison raised a hand, silencing the room. Officer, answer me directly. Did you verify his identity before the arrest? Walker's silence roared louder than words. His head dipped, his fists tightening. No, Your Honor, he admitted, the confession a reluctant whisper. Whispers erupted again, a wave of shock rippling through the gallery. Clara stepped back, her posture rigid, but her eyes burning with purpose. Harrison sighed, his frustration palpable. This is troubling, deeply troubling. Mr. Carter's credentials check out. There was no basis for his detention. Randall made one last desperate play. Your Honor, if I may, you may not. Harrison snapped, cutting him off. The evidence is clear. Mr. Carter was wronged, and this court won't tolerate it. Release him immediately. The bailiff nodded and slipped out, leaving a heavy silence in his wake. Clara exhaled, relief flooding her veins, though her focus never wavered. She caught Walker's glary anger, and shame warring across his face, but she turned away. Her fight was for James. Moments later, James stepped into the courtroom, the bailiff at his side. His suit hung wrinkled from the long night, but his bearing was unshaken. His calm resolve a quiet force that hushed the room. He approached Clara, standing tall despite the ordeal, a pillar unbroken. Mr. Carter, Harrison said, his tone softer now, you're free to go. On behalf of this court, I apologize for what you've endured. James inclined his head, his voice even but resonant. Thank you, Your Honor. But this isn't just about me. Last night exposed a deeper rotone we can't ignore. Harrison studied him, a flicker of respect in his eyes, a fair point. I trust you'll address it in your role. James nodded, I will. As they exited together, Clara's voice dropped to a fierce whisper. This isn't the end. James met her gaze, determination blazing in his eyes. No, it's not. It's the start. The lesson was stark. Justice could falter, but its failure laid bare the cost of unchecked power. For James and Clara, the battle was personal now, a vow to dismantle the flaws that had shackled him. In the stillness of the emptying courtroom, the echo of their footsteps carried a promise. Consequences would come for those who abused their authority, and they'd be the ones to deliver them. Last night, under the dim glow of flickering streetlights, James Carter trudged home after an exhausting meeting that had stretched far past dusk. His polished shoes clicked rhythmically against the uneven pavement, his tailored suit clinging slightly to his frame from the faint dampness of the evening air. The weight of his briefcase tugged at his arm, a tangible reminder of the day's labor. His mind churned with thoughts of reports and deadlines when, without warning, the harsh glare of a patrol car's headlights sliced through the quiet. Two officers stepped out, their boots heavy on the asphalt, their faces shadowed but stern. James froze, his breath catching as their voices barked, order sharp, clipped demands that left no room for question. Confusion swirled in his chest, quickly giving way to a sinking dread. He wasn't a criminal, hadn't done anything to warrant this, yet here he was detained, searched, and stripped of dignity in the middle of the street he'd walked 1,000 times before. The humiliation burned deep, not because of handcuffs or accusations, but because he knew, with a certainty that gnawed at his soul, this wasn't about evidence or suspicion, it was about the way he looked. The next day, standing in a courtroom bathed in cold fluorescent light, James recounted the ordeal. His voice, steady at first, rose with a quiet fire as he spoke, each word deliberate, weighted with the pain of the previous night. The room was packed rows of wooden benches creaking under the shifting weight of onlookers, their faces a mix of curiosity, unease, and quiet judgment. His gaze drifted briefly to the officers seated near the prosecutor's table, their uniforms crisp, their expressions unreadable. One, Officer Walker, stared at the floor, his jaw tight, as if the polished tiles held some secret he couldn't face. James let the silence linger, giving the crowd time to absorb the gravity of his words. "I was walking home," he said, his tone sharpening, "after hours of work, carrying nothing but a briefcase and the exhaustion of a long day. But to them, none of that mattered. My suit, my compliance, my very existence was suspicious." A murmur stirred the air, a ripple of discomfort threading through the audience. He adjusted the microphone with a trembling hand, then leaned closer, his dark eyes blazing with resolve. "This isn't just my story. It's the story of a system that's rotten at its core, one that thrives on bias and profiling, one that fails the very people it's meant to protect." In the audience, a man in a sleek gray suit shot to his feet, his face flushed with indignation. "Privilege," he snapped, his voice cutting through the murmurs like a whip. "You're here because you've got money, a fancy job. Most people don't get that chance. How dare you claim this represents us?" The room tensed. A collective breath held as eyes darted between the two men. James turned to face him, unflinching, his response measured but piercing. "You're right," he conceded, his voice softening yet losing none of its edge. "I'm here because I had an assistant who fought tooth and nail for me, because I've built a life that gives me a platform. But doesn't that prove the problem? Why should justice be a luxury, a prize for those who can afford to claw their way to it?" The man faltered, his bravado crumbling as he sank back into his seat. The sting of James's logic silencing him, James pressed forward, his words now a torrent. "For every one of me, there are 100 Shasandis names we'll never hear. They're stopped, searched, locked away, sometimes killed, all because someone with power decided they didn't fit, didn't belong. That's not justice. That's tyranny dressed up as law." Judge Harrison, perched behind the towering bench, shifted uneasily in his high-backed chair. His weathered face remained a mask of impartiality, but a faint crease in his brow betrayed his discomfort. "Mr. Carter," he interjected, his voice gravelly yet firm, "your point is noted. But let's keep this focused on your case." James met the judge's gaze, his own unwavering. "With all due respect, Your Honor, my case is a thread in a much larger tapestry. To ignore that is to turn our backs on every person who trusts this system to be fair, to be just." The judge's nod was slow, reluctant, a silent admission that James's words carried weight beyond the courtroom's walls. Turning back to the audience, James's tone softened, though his conviction burned brighter than ever. "I don't stand here to vilify every officer. I know the risks they take, the sacrifices they make to keep us safe. But respect doesn't mean silence when they fail you. And last night, they failed me." The murmurs grew louder, a restless hum filling the space. A woman near the back rose, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, her voice dripping with skepticism. "Maybe they wouldn't have stopped you if you hadn't looked suspicious," she challenged, her eyes narrowing. James inhaled deeply, steadying himself against the sting of her words. "Suspicious?" he echoed, his voice low but resonant. "Was it the suit I wore, the briefcase I carried, or was it the skin I've lived in my whole life?" The woman shifted, her confidence wavering as the room's attention bore down on her. She offered no reply, and James continued, his words cutting through the silence. "We have to ask ourselves why some people are branded as threats just for breathing, just for being. If we don't face that, we're all guilty of letting this poison spread." He turned to the bench once more, addressing Judge Harrison directly. "Last night, I was treated like less than a man, but I won't let that moment define me. I'm here because I believe we can rise above this who have to rise above this." The courtroom fell silent, the air thick with the weight of his testimony. Judge Harrison cleared his throat, his voice steady but tinged with finality. "Thank you, Mr. Carter. Your words are duly noted." As James stepped down, the tension lingered, a palpable force pressing against every soul in the room. Some eyes followed him with quiet support, others with thinly veiled doubt. But he felt a flicker of something new, hope, fragile but fierce, that his voice might spark change. At the courtroom doors, Clara waited, her face alight with pride and resolve. She was more than an assistant. She was a confidant, a warrior in her own right. Her sharp mind and unshakable loyalty the backbone of James's fight. "That was powerful," she whispered, her voice a lifeline in the storm of emotions swirling within him. James exhaled, his shoulders slumping slightly. "It's a start," he replied, his tone subdued but resolute. "Now we take it beyond these walls." Clara's nod was immediate, her eyes gleaming with understanding. "A press conference," she suggested, already mapping the next move. A faint smile tugged at James's lips, the first crack in his weary facade. "It's time the people hear this loud and clear." Hours later, the conference room buzzed with chaotic energy. Reporters jostled for space, their notebooks scribbled with frantic notes, while camera crews adjusted lenses, the soft hum of equipment underscoring the clamor of voices. James stood at the podium, flanked by Clara and a handful of allies dressed with purpose, their presence a silent show of solidarity. His suit was fresh, pressed to perfection, but the lines etched into his face told of a sleepless night and a soul weighed by purpose. He gripped the podium's edges, grounding himself as the room hushed, dozens of microphones tilting toward him like eager sentinels. "Good afternoon," he began, his voice calm yet commanding, carrying the authority of a man who'd stared injustice in the face and refused to blink. "Yesterday, I became a faceless figure in a system I've spent my life trying to strengthen. I was stopped, detained, and humiliated, not for anything I'd done, but for assumptions carved into the minds of those who held power over me." He paused, letting the silence stretch, the room's attention hanging on his every breath. "I stand here today not just as a public servant, but as a man who's felt the cold edge of a broken system. This isn't about me alone, it's about accountability, about tearing down the veil of secrecy that shields these failures, about making sure no one else walks home in fear of being judged guilty without cause." A hand shot up from the front row, a reporter, her sharp features framed by a cascade of dark hair. "Mr. Carter," she pressed, "some say the officers were just doing their duty. Couldn't this have been a simple mistake?" James met her gaze, unflinching. "A mistake suggests something fleeting, accidental. What happened to me is a symptom of something deeper, a pattern where people are judged by their skin, not their steps. Calling it a mistake lets it fester unchallenged." Another hand rose, this time a man with a skeptical smirk. "With respect, Mr. Carter, you're part of this system. Isn't it hypocritical to criticize it instead of defending it?" James's jaw tightened, but his voice remained steady. "It's because I'm part of it that I'm speaking out. I've devoted my career to safety, to justice, but blind loyalty doesn't fix what's broken. Real strength lies in facing the cracks and demanding they be mended." The man nodded, his smirk fading under the weight of James's resolve. The room buzzed again, a restless undercurrent of agreement and dissent. James's voice rose, cutting through the noise. "We can't settle for a system where fear drowns trust, where guilt is assumed before innocence is even considered. Accountability isn't an attack, it's a promise to uphold what law enforcement should stand for." A younger reporter leapt to her feet, her voice insistent. "What about those who say this is exaggerated, that your story is an outlier?" James's expression darkened, a shadow of grief crossing his features. "An outlier," he repeated, his tone heavy with sorrow. "For every headline I make, there are countless others buried in silence, people whose lives are upended, whose voices are stifled, whose dignity is trampled. These aren't outliers, they're the heartbeat of a crisis we refuse to face." The room pulsed with energy, the clatter of keyboards mingling with hushed whispers. Clara, standing just off stage, caught James's eye, her nod a silent vow to carry this fight forward. Stepping back slightly, James scanned the sea of faces, his voice softening but unyielding. "I'm not here to tear down. I'm here to build up, to demand training that roots out bias, policies that protect rather than punish, systems that answer to the people they serve. Justice isn't a privilege to be earned, it's a right we're all owed." The tension in the room eased, but the fire of his words lingered, a call to action echoing beyond the microphones. A final reporter raised his hand, his tone calm but probing, ready to push the conversation further, yet the story, like the fight, was far from over. The air in the press conference room buzzed with anticipation, a restless hum threading through the crowd of reporters, activists, and curious onlookers. James Carter stood tall behind the podium, his broad shoulders squared against the weight of expectation pressing down on him. His dark eyes flickered with a quiet intensity as he absorbed the question. that had just been lobbed his way, a probing inquiry about what came next. Beyond the stirring words he'd already delivered, he'd anticipated this moment, felt it simmering beneath the surface of the room's energy. With a slow, deliberate nod, he leaned into the microphone, his voice steady but laced with an undercurrent of resolve. "This gathering," he began, his gaze sweeping across the sea of faces, "is only the opening chapter. Starting today, I'm throwing myself into the trench, us working hand in hand with community leaders who know their neighborhood's pulse, law enforcement officers who walk the beat, and policymakers who can turn ideas into action. Together, we're going to roll out mandatory bias training for every officer on the force. We'll peel back the curtain on policing practices, letting sunlight flood into places too long shrouded in shadow. And we'll build a system that doesn't just demand trust, but earns it where suspicion doesn't get the first word. Real change doesn't bloom in a single night, but it takes root in moments like this, in conversations that refuse to let the status quo stand unchallenged." The room erupted, not in unison, but in a jagged wave of applause that rippled through the crowd. Some clapped with fervor, their hands striking together like thunder, while others sat still, arms crossed, their skepticism etched into furrowed brows. James stepped back from the podium, his chest rising with a deep breath as he scanned the mosaic of reactions before him. There was curiosity in the wide eyes of a young reporter scribbling furiously in her notebook, hostility in the clenched jaw of a man near the back, and faint but unmistakable hope in the upturned faces of a small cluster of community organizers. It was that hope, fragile yet defiant, that anchored him as the noise began to fade. Clara, his sharp-eyed assistant, moved forward with the grace of someone who'd mastered the art of timing. Her subtle gesture signaled the end of the event, and James offered the crowd a brief, appreciative nod before turning toward the stage's edge. The room sprang back to life behind him, a flurry of motion as reporters surged toward the exits, their minds already spinning headlines into existence. By the time James and Clara reached the building's rear exit, the world outside seemed to hum with a different rhythm. Clara's phone vibrated incessantly in her hand, and she glanced down, a faint smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. "The video's live," she said, her voice tinged with quiet triumph. "It's spreading like wildfire." James paused, his expression softening into something introspective. "Good," he murmured, his thoughts drifting to the countless screens now flickering with his words. "The more eyes on this, the harder it'll be to ignore the push for something real." Days later, James sat at the head of a long, polished conference table, the air thick with tension that seemed to cling to the walls. Around him were city officials in crisp suits, community leaders with weathered hands clasped tightly together, and law enforcement representatives whose stiff postures betrayed their unease. A projector cast a glow against the wall behind him, illuminating a detailed proposal titled "Policing for the People, Reform Through Accountability and Training." James cleared his throat, his voice cutting through the silence with a calm authority that demanded attention. "This isn't about pointing fingers," he said, his tone measured but firm. "It's about growing stronger. Trust between the police and the communities they serve has frayed, and we can't mend it with good intentions alone. It starts with education, training officers to see the biases they don't even know they carry. It grows with transparency, letting people see how decisions are made. And it stands on accountability, ensuring that power isn't a blank check." He paused, letting his words settle into the room like stones dropped into still water. "First, every officer will undergo mandatory bias training, not as punishment, but as a lifeline to better judgment in the field. Second, we'll establish a review system for complaints, led by civilians who live the realities we're trying to fix. Third, we'll set clear rules for stops and detentions. No one should feel hunted because of their skin, their clothes, or where they call home." His eyes moved across the table, resting briefly on each face. "This isn't an assault on law enforcement. It's a vote of confidence in what they can become. When trust flows both ways, officers go home safer and citizens sleep easier. That's justice, not blame." Across the table, Captain Daniels shifted in his seat, his grizzled features hardening into a scowl. 30 years on the force had carved deep lines into his face. and his arms crossed tightly over his chest like a shield. He'd made no secret of his contempt from the moment he'd walked in, his boots hitting the floor with a thud that echoed his mood. "Carter," he said, his voice rough and edged with defiance, "I've been doing this job since you were in diapers. You're sitting there preaching about bias training like it's some cure-all. We don't need your fancy lectures, we need bodies on the street, and tools to take down the real threats." His words hung heavy, daring James to flinch. James met his stare, unflinching, his own voice steady as steel. "Resources matter, Captain. No one's arguing that. But what's the point of more gear, more manpower, if the people you're sworn to protect see you as the enemy? Training isn't about coddling anyone, it's about equipping officers to wield their authority with precision, not prejudice." Daniels snorted, leaning forward, his knuckles whitening against the table's edge. "Prejudice? You think my team's out there picking targets for kicks? Maybe you ought to ride along sometime. See what we're up against before you start slinging accusations." A low murmur of agreement rustled through the other officers, their nods subtle but pointed. James drew a slow breath, feeling the weight of their resentment pressing against his ribs. "I'm not accusing you, Captain," he said, his calm unshaken. "But I don't need to ride in your squad car to know what it's like to be profiledo. Feel the sting of suspicion for no reason but the way I look. I've lived it, and so have too many others." Daniel's eyes narrowed, his voice rising like a storm gathering strength. "One rough night doesn't make you a damn expert. Carter, I've got good people out there bleeding for this city, and you're turning them into punching bags for your little PR circus." James's jaw tightened, a flicker of heat rising in his chest, but he held his composure. "This isn't about one night or one officer," he replied, his words deliberate. "It's about a system that's cracked down the middle, failing the people it's meant to serve, cops and civilians alike. I'm not here to tear anyone down. I'm here to build something that lasts." Before Daniels could fire back, Chief Reyes raised a hand, her presence commanding the room into silence. "Enough," she said, her voice a sharp blade slicing through the tension. "Captain, you've said your piece. Let Mr. Carter finish." James offered her a grateful nod, then pressed on. "Change isn't easy. It drags us into the light, forces us to face what's broken. But pretending the cracks don't exist won't seal them. This is about making law enforcement stronger, not weaker, about ensuring every officer walks their beat with pride and every citizen feels seen, not hunted." Reyes tilted her head, her expression cautious but open. "If we greenlight this, Mr. Carter, how do we know it's working?" James turned to the projector, pointing to a chart glowing against the wall. "We track what matters: fewer complaints, better community feedback, fewer stops that end in regret. It won't happen overnight, but accountability is the first step." Daniels muttered something under his breath, too low to catch, but the meeting rolled forward. For the next hour, James navigated a gauntlet of questions, some earnest, some Barbetta's voice never wavering as he fleshed out the plan's bones. By the end, the room grudgingly agreed to a pilot program in a handful of precincts, a tentative first step. As the group dispersed, Daniels lingered, his shadow stretching across the emptying room. He approached James, his grudging tone cutting through the quiet. "You've got nerve, I'll give you that. But don't kid yourself, plenty of folks in here aren't clapping for you." James met his gaze, unflinching. "I'm not chasing applause, Captain. I'm chasing what's right." Daniels studied him, then gave a curt nod and strode off, his boots echoing down the hall. A week later, James stepped into a precinct briefing room, the air thick with the scent of coffee and the murmur of restless officers. He was there to watch the pilot program's training modules take root, his presence a quiet ripple through the space. His eyes landed on Officer Walker, a weary man with a familiar face, the same one who'd snapped cuffs around James's wrists not long ago. Walker froze mid-step, recognition flashing across his features, his discomfort palpable. "Director Carter," he said, his voice stiff as he offered a nod. "Officer Walker," James replied, his tone even, a faint curiosity flickering within him. "Didn't think I'd see you here." Walker shifted, his boots scuffing the floor. "Mandatory," he muttered, his eyes darting away. James let it go, turning his focus to the session as an instructor launched into a discussion on implicit bias. Walker sat rigid, arms crossed, his unease a tangible thing. But James caught something else, a glint of thoughtfulness as the instructor wove real-world stories into the lesson. During a break, James approached him, his voice low but warm. "This stuff's tough to sit through. But you're here, that counts." Walker hesitated, his guard wavering. "I'm not sold on all of it, but maybe there's something worth hearing." James nodded, a quiet victory blooming in his chest. "That's enough for now, just listening." The session resumed, the room's tension easing as officers began to lean into the discussion, their voices rising with reluctant curiosity. James watched, his mind tracing the long road ahead. Justice wasn't a gavel strike, it was a slow, steady chisel, carving away at power's excesses until something truer emerged. And here, in this small room, that work had begun. The air in the room hung heavy with anticipation as the instructor's voice cut through the silence, sharp and deliberate. "How do assumptions, whether you're aware of them or not, shape the decisions you make out there?" His gaze swept across the sea of faces, each officer seated stiffly in their metal chairs, the faint hum of fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. For a moment, no one dared to breathe, the question lingering like a challenge. Then, to the astonishment of everyone present, Harris lifted his hand. His fingers trembled slightly, betraying the storm of emotions swirling beneath his calm exterior. "It's everything," he said, his voice low but steady, as though he'd rehearsed the words 100 times in his mind. "You don't always see it happening. They drill into you to trust your gut, to act fast, and you do. But that gut, it's built on things you never even think to question." His eyes flickered downward, tracing the scuff marks on the tiled floor, as if the weight of his own admission pressed him into the ground. The instructor tilted his head, a faint nod signaling approval. "That's a sharp observation," he replied. "The first step to fixing it is knowing it's there." Harris swallowed hard, his chest tightening with a mix of resolve and dread. Then, with a sudden scrape that echoed through the stillness, his chair grinding harshly against the floor, he rose to his feet. Every pair of eyes followed him, wide and unblinking, as he turned to face James Carter, the man seated near the front, whose presence commanded the room without effort. "Director Carter," Harris began, his voice catching for a fleeting second before he forced it steady. "I owe you an apology." The air grew thick, almost suffocating, as the other officers shifted in their seats, their breaths held in collective suspense. But Harris pressed on, undeterred. "That night he knew something was off. I could see it in your face, in the way you stood there. Hands raised, not a threat to anyone, and I didn't say a damn thing. I let fear off, stepping out of line, of breaking the unspoken code, keep me quiet when I should have spoken up. I failed to do what was right, and I'm sorry." The words landed like stones in a still pond, rippling outward, stirring something deep in the room. James studied Harris for a long moment, his face a mask of calm, though his dark eyes flickered with a quiet intensity. Slowly, he stood, his movements deliberate, the faint creak of his chair adding to the gravity of the moment. "Thank you, Officer Harris," he said, his voice even but resonant, cutting through the tension like a blade. "It takes guts to own up to a mistake. That courageous willingness to face what we've done wrong is what sparks real change." Harris exhaled, a wave of relief crashing over him, softening the rigid lines of his shoulders as he sank back into his seat. The room settled into a hush, no longer taut with unease, but steeped in a thoughtful stillness. Not everyone was ready to let the moment linger. Walker, a weary man with a perpetual scowl etched into his weathered face, shifted uncomfortably in his chair, the metal groaning under his restless weight. Finally, he snapped the silence with a voice sharp as broken glass. "This training, it's not some magic fix for the real world," he said, his tone laced with defiance. "Out there, it's chaos. People don't play by the rules, and we don't get the luxury of overthinking every move." His fingers drummed impatiently on the armrest, betraying the agitation simmering beneath his words. James turned to meet Walker's glare, his expression firm yet devoid of hostility. "You're not wrong," he said, his voice steady as bedrock. "The job's messy, it's dangerous, but that's exactly why days like this matter. It's not about hesitating, it's about training your instincts to lean on justice, not fear." Walker scoffed, a harsh sound that grated against the quiet. "Justice doesn't stop bullets," he shot back, his lips curling into a sneer. James didn't flinch. "No, it doesn't," he conceded, his tone unwavering. "But justice builds trust, and trust, that can save your life and the lives of the people you swore to protect." The room fell silent again, the weight of James's words settling into the cracks of doubt. Walker didn't reply, but the hard edge in his posture softened, his arms uncrossing as he leaned back, staring at the ceiling as if wrestling with an answer he wasn't ready to voice. James seized the moment, stepping forward, his voice rising with a fire that filled the space. "We've all got a part to play in mending what's broken. This isn't about pointing fingers or wallowing in guilt. It's about forging a system that works for everyone. That starts with each of us, right here, looking hard at ourselves and asking, what can I do better?" The officers listened, their faces a mosaic of emotions, some pensive, others conflicted, a few still guarded. James knew the road to change was long, winding, and fraught with resistance. But as he scanned the room, he saw glimmers of understanding, fragile seeds of progress taking root in the stillness. When the session ended, Harris lingered, his boots scuffing the floor as he approached James. "Thank you," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper, "for accepting my apology. I want to be better." James rested a hand on his shoulder, the gesture firm yet warm. "That's all I ask," he said, a faint smile tugging at his lips. Nearby, Walker hovered by the door, his sharp eyes flicking to James for a fleeting second before he slipped out without a word. It wasn't a triumph, not yet, just the first tentative step on a jagged path. That evening, James sat alone in the dim light of his office, the day's events replaying in his mind like a film he couldn't pause, confronting the officers who'd once restrained him hands rough. Voices cold had been a bitter pill to swallow, but it was necessary, a wound that had to be opened to heal. Harris's apology had lit a spark of hope in him, proof that even the stiffest systems could bend under the weight of conscience. Walker's silence, though, gnawed at him, a reminder that change didn't sweep in like a tide but crept forward, inch by stubborn inch. Days later, James stood on a makeshift stage in a bustling community center, the room packed to the brim with faceless activists with clenched fists, citizens with weary eyes, even a handful of officers in crisp uniforms. The crowd had swelled since his ordeal, drawn by the quiet power of his voice. "Reform isn't about tearing it all down," he declared, his words ringing out clear and strong. "It's about rebuilding stronger, fairer, so it serves every last one of us. Together we can make that real." Applause thundered through the space, but James waved it down, his urgency cutting through the noise. "This isn't just about me. It's about what's been rotting for too long and making damn sure the next generation doesn't grow up scared of the very people meant to keep them safe." His words ignited something fierce. Across the city, grassroots groups sprang up like wildfire, their signs demanding transparency, their voices chanting for fairness. Social media buzzed with hashtags and grainy video scam speeches, raw testimonies from those who'd tasted injustice. One clip burned brighter than the rest, a mother, her voice trembling as tears streaked her face, recounting how her teenage son wrongly detained came home because of James's push for stricter arrest reviews. "My boy's here tonight because of Director Carter," she said, her gratitude raw and unfiltered. The video spread like wildfire, shared millions of times, a beacon of what could be. The Civilian Oversight Board James had fought for now stood tall, its members teachers, shopkeepers, retirees drawn from every corner of the city. They dug into cases with a clarity that had once been a distant dream. In one hearing, they tackled an officer's excessive force, a grizzled 15-year veteran with a clenched jaw and a badge worn smooth. Suspended, not sacked, he'd face retraining. The decision wasn't vengeance, it was balance, a signal that justice wasn't a hammer but a bridge. Most cheered it, seeing trust take root where suspicion once thrived. Not everyone sang his praises, in the precinct's shadowed corners and on blaring talk shows. Critics sharpened their knives, anti-police, they snarled, branding his reforms a reckless overreach. One night, on a national news set, the host leaned in, his voice dripping with venom. "Mr. Carter, some say you're gutting law enforcement. What do you tell them? James didn't blink. I tell them strength isn't hiding behind a badge, he said, cool as steel. It's accountability. The police are strongest when people trust the man. Trust dies without fairness. The clip exploded online, splitting the world into cheers and jeers, cementing James as a lightning rod for a divided age. His fight rippled far beyond the city. Community leaders from distant states called, hungry for blueprints. College lecture halls filled to hear him speak. His name splashed across headlines as a testament to grit and rebirth. One evening, Clara's sharp-eyed assistant strode into his office, a thick envelope in hand. Civic Leadership Award, she said, tossing it onto his desk. James arched a brow, skepticism creasing his face as he pushed it aside. I'm not here for trophies. Clara, she smirked, undeterred. It's not about you. It's about what you stand for. Take it, light a fire under someone else. He nodded, though his eyes stayed fixed on the horizon. The work outweighing the praise. Months rolled on, and the reforms bore fruit. Complaints in pilot precincts plummeted by 30%. Community meetings, once ghost towns, now buzzed with vociferers and citizens trading hard truths over folding tables. James pressed harder, lobbying for statewide laws. His days a blur of speeches and late-night strategy huddles. One night, Clara's voice broke through the haze. You've built something huge, James, but you're running on fumes. Rest. He shook his head, his jaw tight. Every day we stall, someone's life hangs in the balance. I stop when it's done. The war wasn't won. Some precincts dug in their heels. Communities eyed the changes warily, and old biases clung like rust. But every inch gained, every apology, every policy, every shaky step was a testament to what justice could mean when power faced its reckoning. For James, that was enough to keep fighting. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm golden hue over the streets, James Carter strolled through a neighborhood that had once simmered with tension. Between its residents and the police, the air felt lighter now, a subtle shift he could sense in the way people moved, their shoulders less hunched, their glances less wary. His footsteps echoed softly against the pavement when a young officer approached him, his uniform crisp, but his demeanor betraying a flicker of unease. The officer's hands were shoved deep into his pockets, fingers fidgeting with something unseen, perhaps a nervous habit he couldn't shake. Director Carter, he began, his voice trembling slightly, as though he'd rehearsed this moment a dozen times in his head. I just wanted to tell you something. I used to think all this talk about reform was just noisy, empty promises from politicians who didn't care. But those training sessions, they've changed me. I see my job differently now. I've handled calls with a calmer head, listened more than I used to, and it's actually made things better. James stopped walking, turning to face the young man fully. Gratitude welled up inside him, softening the lines of exhaustion etched into his face after years of tireless work. He could see the officer's sincerity, the way his shoulders squared slightly as he spoke, as if unburdening himself had given him a newfound strength. Thank you for telling me that, James replied, his voice warm but firm. Keep showing others what's possible. Lead by example. That's how we rebuild trust, one honest moment at a time. The officer's lips curved into a tentative smile, his nerves melting away like frost under the morning sun. As he walked off, his stride grew steadier, and James watched him go, a quiet ember of hope reigniting in his chest. The work drained him, left him bone-weary some days, but encounters like this were the fuel that kept him going, a reminder that every step forward mattered. Later that week, James found himself in a cavernous auditorium, its high ceilings amplifying the hum of anticipation that filled the space. The room was a mosaic of humanity, community leaders in sharp suits, officers in pressed uniforms, activists with fire in their eyes, students scribbling notes, and ordinary citizens drawn by the gravity of James's story. The stage was bare save for a podium and a microphone, but the atmosphere crackled with an electric charge, as if the very walls held their breath. When James stepped forward, the crowd hushed instantly, a reverent silence settling over them like a blanket. He adjusted the microphone with deliberate care, his fingers brushing its cool metal as he scanned the sea of faces. For a moment, he stood still, the weight of their expectations pressing against his chest. His brow furrowed slightly, a flicker of vulnerability crossing his features as he gathered his thoughts. Then he spoke, his voice cutting through the stillness with a clarity that demanded attention. "I'm here today not as a man with every answer, but as someone who's learned what happens when we stop asking the hard questions." His words carried a quiet power, each syllable laced with the memory of a night that had changed him forever. "A year ago," he continued, "I was humiliated, handcuffed, and held like I was a danger to everyone around me just for existing. That injustice could have broken me, but instead, it woke me up. It reminded me of a truth we too often forget. We all have the power to demand something better." The audience leaned in, captivated, their eyes locked on him as if he were pulling back a curtain on their own buried frustrations. "Change isn't a gift that falls into our laps," James said, his tone sharpening with resolve. "It's not born from wishful thinking or waiting for someone else to fix things. It comes from facing the ugly realities head-on, from standing tall when every instinct screams to back down." A murmur rippled through the crowd, a wave of recognition, but James didn't waver. His hands tightened around the podium's edges, knuckles whitening as he pressed forward. "What happened to me wasn't a one-off. It's a story that unfolds every day, in every corner of this country, to people whose names we'll never learn, whose cries we'll never hear. That's why we're here, not just for my story, but for all of them." He paused, letting the silence stretch, his gaze piercing the room. "This isn't only about fixing a broken system," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper that somehow carried more weight than a shout. "It's about how we see each other. Bias, whether we admit it or not, builds walls between us, brick by brick, until we're blind to the humanity on the other side. We can't keep raising those barriers." He leaned forward, eyes blazing with conviction. "I know some of you doubt this. You're sitting there thinking this is just another speech, another spark that'll fade by morning. But hear me. The only thing that ensures we fail is if we stop trying." A few hands clapped tentatively, but James raised a palm, his expression stern. "This isn't about applause. It's about what you do when you leave this room. It's about showing up, day after day, especially when it feels impossible." From the front row, a young woman in a police uniform rose to her feet, her posture rigid but her voice steady. "Director Carter, what do you say to people who feel powerless? To those who've fought for change and come up empty?" James turned to her, his face softening with empathy. He saw the faint shadows under her eyes, the way her hands clasped tightly together, signs of a struggle she carried silently. "I say this," he replied, his words measured but brimming with belief. "Failure isn't the finish line. Every time you speak, every time you push forward, even if it's just an inch, it counts. Real power isn't in big wins. It's in not giving up, in refusing to let your voice fade." She nodded slowly, her shoulders relaxing as if his words had lifted a weight she'd borne too long. There was a depth to her now, a quiet resolve that hadn't been there before, and James felt it echo through the room. He straightened, his voice swelling to fill every corner of the auditorium. "To the officers here today, that badge you wear isn't just a shield of authority, it's a promise of trust. But trust isn't given, it's earned, guarded, fought for. Every choice you make ripples outward, shaping not just how people see you, but how they see the whole system. That's a heavy burden, but it's also a chance to prove what justice can look like." He shifted his focus to the civilians, his gaze sweeping over them like a lighthouse beam. "And to every one of you, don't ever let anyone tell you your voice doesn't matter. Accountability doesn't start with the system, it starts with you demanding it. Keep asking questions. Keep holding the line. This is a partnership, and it needs every single one of us." The room fell silent again, his words sinking deep into the crowd like rain into parched earth. James exhaled, his grip on the podium loosening as the tension in his body ebbed. "People ask me why I keep going, why I don't hand this fight to someone else. My answer's simple: because I can, because I have to, and because if I don't, who will?" He leaned closer to the microphone, his next words slow and deliberate, each one a hammer striking stone. "We all have the power to change things. You don't need a title or a stage. You need courage, grit, and the stubborn belief that better days are possible." The audience stirred, a quiet swell of agreement building among them. James raised a hand, gesturing to the faces before him. "You being here today choosing to show up, to listen, to care, that's proof change can happen. It starts with a decision, a refusal to accept that this is as good as it gets." The applause began softly, a hesitant patter, then roared into a thunderous wave that shook the room. But James wasn't done. He lifted his voice above the noise, his final plea ringing out like a battle cry. "We all have a part to play, no matter how small it seems. Every step, every word, every stand we take builds something bigger. Together, we can forge a system rooted not in fear or division, but in fairness, justice, and the best of what we can be." The crowd surged to their feet, the sound deafening. But James's last words sliced through it all, sharp and unshakable. "We can be the change this world needs. All it takes is faith in ourselves and the guts to act." Meanwhile, in the quiet suburb of Pine Grove, the Sunday morning sun bathed the streets in a gentle glow. Dr. Michelle Thompson knelt by the front door, packing a small cooler with snacks for her daughter Emma's park diet ritual. They'd cherished for 3 years, ever since Emma had come into her life. Michelle's hands moved with practiced ease, tucking in an extra juice box as she glanced at the 5-year-old bouncing nearby. Emma's blonde curls danced with every hop, her pink sneakers flashing tiny bursts of light. "Ready for the park, sweetie?" Michelle asked, her voice soft with affection. Emma's eager nod was all the answer she needed, her wide eyes sparkling with anticipation. The walk to Riverside Park was a short stroll, just 2 blocks from their cozy 2-story home. Michelle held Emma's tiny hand, her daughter's chatter filling the air with stories of a butterfly she'd spotted in their garden. "That morning its wings a vivid orange," she said, "like the sunset." These moments were Michelle's sanctuary, a slice of peace amid her demanding life as a doctor. As they reached the playground, Emma's face lit up at the sight of the new swing set, its chains glinting in the sunlight. The park was tranquil at this hour, dotted with familiar faces, old Mr. Johnson shuffling along with his golden retriever, its tail wagging like a metronome. Mrs. Martinez laughing as her twins raced down the slide, their shrieks of joy piercing the calm. Michelle waved to them, a quiet contentment settling over her as she watched Emma run toward the swings, her laughter a melody against the morning stillness. James Carter's journey and Michelle's simple joy wove together a larger truth. Justice and accountability aren't abstract ideals, but living, breathing forces shaped by every choice, every interaction. The young officer's transformation, the crowd's awakening, even Emma's carefree sprint across the playground were threads in a tapestry of consequence. A reminder that power misused can fracture trust, while power wielded with care can heal it. The lesson was clear. Change begins with the courage to act, and its echoes reach far beyond the moment, touching lives in ways both grand and small. The sun hung pleasantly in the sky over Riverside Park, casting a golden glow across the sprawling playground where laughter and the squeak of swings filled the air. Emma's voice broke through the symphony of childish delight, her blue eyes gleaming with uncontainable excitement as she tugged at her mother's hand. "Mommy, can we go on the swings first?" she asked, her small frame practically vibrating with anticipation. Michelle, her heart swelling with a tender ache, couldn't help but smile at the sight of her daughter so vibrant, so alive with joy. She thought back to those early days when Emma had first come into her life at just 2 years old, a fragile little girl with wide, uncertain eyes. Back then, Emma had been a shadow of the child she was now, shuffled between 3 foster homes, her trust in the world worn thin. But here, at 5, she was a burst of light, confident and fearless, a testament to the love and patience that had slowly rebuilt her sense of safety. Together, they approached the swings, the chains glinting faintly in the morning sun. Michelle lifted Emma onto the seat with a gentle care that had become second nature, her hands steady as she adjusted the girl's position. She began to push, the motion soft at first, a rhythmic sway that drew giggles from Emma's lips. "Higher, Mommy, higher," Emma called out, her voice ringing with pure, unfiltered glee. Michelle obliged, her arms moving with practiced ease, though her eyes never strayed far from her daughter, always mindful of the height, the speed, the invisible line between thrill and danger. The sound of Emma's laughter danced through the air, a melody that wrapped around Michelle's heart and pulled her into the moment. As they played, Michelle's gaze drifted across the park, catching sight of a woman seated on a bench near the playground's edge. She hadn't seen her before, a striking figure, perhaps in her 50s, with gray hair styled in an impeccable bob that spoke of meticulous care. Dressed in expensive workout clothes, crisp leggings, and a sleek jacket, looked more like she'd stepped out of a catalog than a morning jog. Her presence was unremarkable at first, just another face in the weekend crowd. But there was something in the way her eyes lingered on them, sharp and unwavering, that stirred a familiar unease in Michelle's chest. As a black mother raising a white child, she'd grown accustomed to the weight of curious stares, the occasional flicker of judgment or suspicion. She'd learned to brush it off, to shield Emma from the world's biases. But the intensity of this woman's attention prickled at her senses. Still, she pushed the feeling aside, unwilling to let it tarnish the brightness of their day. Emma, blissfully unaware, was lost in her own universe of delight. "Look, Mommy, I'm flying," she shouted, her legs stretching out toward the endless blue above, her blonde hair whipping in the breeze. Michelle laughed softly, her focus snapping back to her daughter's radiant face. After a while, they left the swings behind and wandered to the sandbox, a patch of soft earth where Emma's imagination thrived. Michelle settled on the edge, her knees sinking slightly into the sand as she handed Emma her pink plastic bucket, a cherished relic of countless park visits. Alongside it came the rest of Emma's treasured arsenal, a tiny shovel, a handful of seashells for decoration, and an assortment of molds in every size, perfect for crafting towers and turrets. Emma plunged into her work with fervor, her small hands scooping sand as Michelle guided her, showing her how to pack it just right. Soon, other children trickled over, drawn by the promise of play. Michelle watched with quiet pride as Emma shared her toys without a second thought, her generosity a hard-won victory. There had been a time when Emma would shrink at the sight of another child, clutching Michelle's legs like a lifeline. Now, she was the one offering a seashell to a curly-haired boy, her smile wide and unguarded. "Mommy, can you help me make a big tower?" Emma asked, her voice brimming with ambition as she dragged the largest mold toward her. Michelle leaned in, her fingers pressing the sand alongside Emma's, their teamwork yielding a grand castle adorned with shells and encircled by a makeshift moat. The creation stood proud, a monument to their shared effort, and Michelle felt a swell of gratitude for these simple, sacred moments. The park buzzed with life around them. Parents nodded greetings, some familiar faces from weekends past. Michelle was no stranger. Harriger Thompson, the pediatrician from Pine Grove Medical Center, was a fixture in the community. Her warm demeanor and dedication to the PTA at Emma's preschool had earned her a quiet respect among the families. The morning unfolded like a dream, the weather crisp and inviting, Emma's laughter a constant refrain. Michelle pulled out her phone, snapping photos of Emma posing beside their sandy masterpiece, her chest tight with the kind of love that bordered on reverence. These were the memories she'd clung to during the grueling 2-year adoption process, the promise of days like this keeping her afloat. But beneath the surface of their idyllic Sunday, a shadow was creeping closer. The woman on the bench, Patricia Weber, as Michelle would later learn, had shifted her posture, her phone now raised in her hands. She was recording them, her gaze cold and unyielding, fixed on Michelle and Emma with a scrutiny that felt like a violation. Michelle's stomach tightened, a storm brewing in the distance of her mind, though for now, she held fast to the fleeting peace of their park day, her daughter's hand warm in hers. Across the playground, Patricia sat perched on her usual bench, a self-appointed sentinel of Pine Grove's order. She'd only been in the neighborhood 3 weeks, but already she'd cast herself as its protector, a role she wore with the same pride as her designer athleisure wear, running shoes included. Though the idea of breaking a sweat seemed laughable, her morning had been a dull stretch of routine until Michelle and Emma arrived, their presence jarring her neatly ordered worldview. Patricia's eyes narrowed as she studied them, her thoughts racing down a dark, prejudiced path. To her, families were supposed to fit a certain mold, and Michelle's dark skin, beside Emma's pale complexion, did align with the rigid boxes she'd constructed in her mind. Her fingers itched as she pulled out her phone, opening the neighborhood watch group chat. She typed furiously, "Suspicious activity at Riverside Park. African American woman with a white child. Something doesn't seem right." She hesitated, her thumb hovering over the send button, a flicker of doubt tugging at her. Evidence. She decided she needed more. Zooming in with her camera, she began filming, capturing every move Michelle and Emma made. She missed it all, tenderness in Michelle's touch as she steadied Emma on the swing, the pride that lit her face when Emma shared her toys, the careful way they sculpted their castle together. Instead, Patricia's lens filtered everything through a haze of suspicion, twisting love into something sinister. Her behavior didn't go unnoticed. Mrs. Martinez, a weary woman with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense air, stood near the sandbox, her twins playing a few feet away. She'd known Michelle and Emma for years, had watched them grow into this park's fabric. Her glances toward Patricia were laced with worry, her lips pressing into a thin line. Mr. Johnson, a grizzled retiree walking his scruffy terrier, slowed his steps as he passed the bench, his weathered face creasing with unease. He'd always greeted Michelle with a tip of his cap, Emma with a playful wink. The tension radiating from Patricia set his nerves on edge, and he lingered nearby, his dog snuffling at the grass as he kept watch. Patricia, oblivious to the growing disapproval, muttered to herself, "This has gone on long enough." She rose from the bench, smoothing her yoga pants with a flourish, her phone still recording as she strode toward the sandbox. In her mind, she rehearsed her confrontation, convinced she was moments away from unveiling some grand truth, a hero in her own warped narrative. Emma was mid-sentence, showing Michelle a seashell she'd unearthed. When Patricia's shadow loomed over them, Michelle looked up, her breath catching as she recognized the woman who'd been staring. Instinctively, she edged closer to Emma, who pressed against her side, her small body tensing with an unspoken fear. "Excuse me," Patricia declared, her voice cutting through the playground's hum. Loud enough to turn heads, she held her phone aloft, the red recording dot glaring like an accusation. "I need to ask you some questions about this child." Nearby parents froze, some drifting closer, their faces a mix of curiosity and concern. Michelle inhaled deeply, steadying herself. She'd faced this before, prying eyes, veiled hostility, but never with such audacity. "I'm Emma's mother," she said, her tone firm yet measured, reaching into her bag where she kept Emma's adoption papers, a shield against the world's doubts. Patricia's lips curled into a sneer, her sarcasm dripping like venom. "Oh, really? Because I find that hard to believe. I've been watching you too, and something just isn't right here." She emphasized the word, her phone unwavering as Emma clung tighter to Michelle's arm. "Mommy," the girl whispered, her voice quaking with confusion and dread. Michelle's heart splintered at the sound, her arm wrapping protectively around her daughter as she fought to keep her composure. The crowd thickened. Mrs. Martinez edged closer, her twins peering from behind her. Their game forgotten, Mr. Johnson stood resolute, his dog now sitting at his feet, both of them fixated on the unfolding scene. Patricia pressed on, her voice rising. "I've been sitting here for the past hour, and I think everyone would agree this needs investigating." She scanned the onlookers, expecting a chorus of support, but met only silence and stony glares. Michelle rose to her feet, Emma tucked against her, the girls trembling, a quiet ache in her bones. She'd weathered prejudice before, but this brazen intrusion, this filming of her child felt like a violation too far. The park fell hushed, the laughter of children replaced by the creak of empty swings swaying in the breeze. Patricia, undeterred, continued her tirade, blind to the community's disgust. Michelle's hand slipped to her pocket, closing around her own phone. She'd learned long ago to document, to protect herself and Emma from those who wielded power without cause. "I want to see some ID," Patricia demanded, stepping closer, her voice sharp with entitlement. "And papers proving you're related to this child." Emma shrank further behind Michelle, her face buried against her mother's leg. "Ma'am," Michelle replied, her voice steady as steel, the same tone she used with unruly parents at her practice. "You have no authority to demand anything from me or my daughter. You're frightening her, and I'm asking you to step back." But Patricia puffed up, her chest swelling with self-righteous fury. "I'm a concerned citizen, she proclaimed, addressing the crowd as if rallying troops. "I have every right to protect children in our community. How do we know you haven't taken her?" That was the breaking point. Mrs. Martinez surged forward, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "Michelle and Emma have been coming to this park for years. You're the one causing trouble here." Her twins watched wide-eyed, sensing the gravity of their mother's anger. Patricia waved her off with a dismissive flick of her hand. "You don't know what could be going on. Things aren't always what they seem." She turned back to Michelle, her phone still raised, her conviction unshaken. In that moment, the lesson crystallized just for Patricia, but for everyone watching. Justice wasn't hers to wield like a weapon, nor was it born from suspicion and unchecked power. It lived in the quiet strength of Michelle's stand, in the community's unspoken pact to protect its own. Patricia's abuse of her self-imposed authority had unraveled her credibility, exposing the consequences of prejudice masquerading as duty. For Michelle, it was a bitter reminder of the battles she'd fought and would continue to face, but also a triumph of love over ignorance. And for Emma, trembling but safe in her mother's embrace, it was a world still worth believing in, only where the swings arc and the sandbox's castles could outshine the shadows cast by those too blind to see the truth. At Riverside Park, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the grass, painting the scene in hues of gold and amber. Michelle Thompson stood near the sandbox, her heart pounding as her phone buzzed in her pocket. It was a text from her husband, David, confirming he was already racing toward them after she'd sent him a hurried message about the confrontation unfolding. The air felt thick with tension, and Michelle's chest tightened as she glanced at her daughter, Emma, who sat quietly in the sandbox, her small hands clutching a plastic shovel. The little girl's blonde curls bounced slightly as she looked up, her wide blue eyes catching the fading light. Michelle took a slow, deliberate breath, steeling herself. She wasn't about to let this woman, the stranger named Patricia, intimidate her, or shatter the fragile sense of safety she'd worked so hard to build for her daughter. Kneeling down beside Emma, Michelle brushed a strand of hair from the child's face, her voice softening despite the storm brewing inside her. "Sweetie," she began, her tone steady but laced with warmth, "do you remember what we talked about? How some people might not understand our family because it's a little different." Emma's lip trembled and tears welled up, glistening like tiny jewels in her eyes. She nodded slowly, then threw her arms around Michelle's neck, her voice rising defiantly above the murmur of the gathering crowd. "You're my mommy, forever and ever, you promised." The words rang out, raw and unshakable, piercing through the park's stillness. Around them, a few parents exchanged glances, their faces softening with sympathy, while others whispered quietly among themselves. Nearby, Mr. Johnson, a weary man in his 50s with salt and pepper hair, stood with his golden retriever, Max, whose tail wagged lazily despite the tension. He'd been walking Max when the commotion started, and now he fumbled with his phone, his thick fingers tapping the screen to record Patricia's escalating outburst. His brow furrowed as he muttered under his breath, "Folks like her think they can just throw their weight around. Not today." The retriever nudged his leg, oblivious to the drama, but offering a quiet comfort that grounded him. Patricia, meanwhile, stood a few feet away, her designer sunglasses perched atop her head and her manicured nails gripping her phone. "This is ridiculous," she snapped, her voice sharp enough to cut through the chatter. But beneath the bravado, a flicker of doubt crept into her expression. Her eyes darted toward the growing crowd, and her lips pressed into a thin line. She jabbed at her phone with trembling hands, dialing 911 as if it were a weapon she could wield. "I'm calling the police," she declared, her tone dripping with self-righteous indignation. "They'll sort this out." Michelle rose to her full height, her posture unwavering as she met Patricia's gaze. At 5'8", she matched the other woman's stature, but her calm resolve made her seem taller. "Yes, please do," she replied, her voice smooth and unshaken. "I'd love to file a harassment complaint, and I'm sure the police will be very interested in why you're filming my daughter without my consent." The words landed like a quiet thunderclap, and Patricia's face flushed a deep crimson. Her fingers faltering on the phone, she turned away, pacing a few steps toward the park entrance as she spoke into the receiver. her voice dropping to a hushed, urgent pitch. "Hello, yes, I'm at Riverside Park. There's a suspicious situation with a child." By now, more parents had drifted closer, their curiosity morphing into something protective. They formed a loose circle round Michelle and Emma, their presence a silent rebuke to Patricia's accusations. A teenage boy on a skateboard rolled by, his messy black hair whipping in the breeze as he shot Patricia a withering glare. "My moms get this kind of crap too," he called out to Michelle, his voice rough with teenage bravado but sincere. "It's messed up." He kicked his board into a spin and sped off, leaving the words hanging in the air like a challenge. Emma tugged at the hem of Michelle's shirt, her small fingers twisting the fabric. "Can we go home?" "Mommy," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the rustling leaves. "I don't like the angry lady." Michelle's heart clenched, a sharp ache spreading through her chest as she saw the fear in her daughter's eyes. Every instinct screamed at her to scoop Emma up and leave, to shield her from this ugliness. But she knew running would only deepen the wound, teaching Emma that they had to flee from cruelty rather than face it. Instead, she sank onto a weathered wooden bench, pulling Emma onto her lap. The girl's warmth against her steadied Michelle's racing pulse. "We're staying right here." "Sweetheart," she murmured, brushing her lips against Emma's forehead. "Daddy's coming, and we're going to show that lady we don't run away when people are mean. What do we say about being brave?" Emma nestled closer, her cheek pressed against Michelle's shoulder as she recited in a small but firm voice. "Being brave doesn't mean you're not scared. It means doing the right thing even when you are." Michelle smiled faintly, pride swelling beneath her anxiety as she hugged her daughter tighter. Mrs. Martinez, a petite woman with warm brown eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, approached with her twin boys in tow. The 6-year-olds, Diego and Mateo, clutched their soccer ball, their matching sneakers scuffed from an afternoon of play. She sat beside Michelle, her presence a quiet anchor. "The police will be here soon," she said, her voice low but resolute. "And we're all staying with you. No one gets to treat our families like this in this neighborhood." Her words carried the weight of experience. She'd faced her own share of sit-along glances as a single mother raising rambunctious twins. The boys plopped down on the grass, kicking the ball between them, their laughter a small rebellion against the tension. Michelle's throat tightened, gratitude mingling with the tears prickling at her eyes. She could still hear Patricia in the distance, her voice rising and falling as she tried to spin her story for the police. But surrounded by neighbors who knew Herwood'd seen her at school pickups, park playdates, and community barbecues, threat felt less daunting. The park buzzed with quiet solidarity, a stark contrast to the chaos Patricia had ignited. Then came the sound of sirens, slicing through the air as two police cruisers rolled into view. Their red and blue lights flashed across the trees, casting eerie patterns on the ground. Patricia hurried toward the park entrance, waving her arms with a triumphant smirk, certain she was about to be vindicated. Officer Sarah Chen stepped out of the first car, her dark hair pulled into a tight bun, her expression calm but assessing. Beside her, Officer Marcus Rodriguez adjusted his cap, his broad shoulders relaxed but alert. From the second cruiser emerged Officers Thompson and Walker, their boots crunching on the gravel as they scanned the scene. A crowd of parents, a frantic woman gesturing wildly, and a mother cradling her tearful child. "I'm the one who called," Patricia announced, striding toward the officers with her phone still clutched in her hand. "I've been recording everything." That woman, she thrust an accusatory finger at Michelle, has a child that clearly isn't hers. Her voice trembled with conviction, but there was a brittleness to it now, as if she sensed the tide turning. Officer Chen, a seasoned veteran with a sharp eye for human behavior, exchanged a glance with Rodriguez. She'd adopted her own son years ago and recognized the ugly undercurrent of Patricia's words. "All too well, ma'am," she said, her tone firm but measured. "Please lower your voice and stop pointing. We'll get this sorted out." Just then, a silver Tesla screeched to a stop at the curb, and David Thompson leapt out, his tie loosened and his suit jacket flapping as he ran toward his family. His dark hair was disheveled from the wind, and worry etched deep lines into his face. "Michelle." "Emma," he called, his voice cracking with relief. Emma's head snapped up, her tear-streaked face breaking into a radiant smile. "Daddy," she cried, scrambling off Michelle's lap and racing toward him. David swept her into his arms, her small body melting against his chest as she buried her face in his neck. He crossed the grass in long strides, wrapping an arm around Michelle's shoulders as she stood to meet him. The sight of their reunion, so natural, so fiercely loving, sent a ripple through the crowd. Patricia's jaw dropped, her phone slipping slightly in her grip. The smug certainty she'd worn like armor began to crack, her eyes darting between the family and the officers. But she stammered, grasping for words that wouldn't come. Officer Rodriguez approached the Thompsons, his demeanor gentle despite the badge gleaming on his chest. "Good morning, folks," he said with a small smile. "I understand there's been some confusion. Could you tell me your side of this?" Michelle nodded, reaching into her bag with steady hands. "I'm Dr. Michelle Thompson," she began, her voice clear and composed. "This is my husband, David, and our daughter, Emma. We adopted her 3 years ago." She produced a folder, its edges worn from frequent use, and handed it over adoption papers, family ID cards, the tangible proof of their bond. She'd learned early on to carry it, a shield against the world's skepticism. As Officer Chen reviewed the documents, Rodriguez turned to the crowd, gathering statements. Mrs. Martinez stepped forward, her twins trailing behind her like ducklings, and showed the officers her own recording of Patricia's tirade. Mr. Johnson followed, offering his footage with a gruff, "This ought to clear things up." The golden retriever wagged its tail, nudging Rodriguez's leg as if to vouch for its owner's account. Emma wriggled in David's arms, her voice rising suddenly. "My mommy's the best mommy," she declared, loud enough to carry across the park. "She makes me chicken soup when I'm sick and reads me 3 stories at bedtime." The angry lady was being mean to her. The simplicity of her words cut through the noise, and a few parents chuckled softly, their faces softening with affection. Patricia's complexion drained to a ghostly white as the officers turned their attention to her. Officer Thompson's relation to the family approached, her notepad open and her expression stern. "Ma'am," she said, her voice clipped, "we need to talk. Recording a minor without consent is a serious issue. And filing a false report with emergency services? That's another problem entirely." Patricia's shoulders slumped, her designer scarf and expensive phone suddenly feeling like hollow trappings. As the weight of her actions settled over her, "Tu was just trying to protect," she faltered, her excuse dissolving into the air. David tightened his grip on his family, his voice low and tender. "Are you both okay?" Michelle nodded, though he felt the faint tremor in her frame. Emma, calmer now, kept one eye on Patricia, her small brow furrowed with distrust. Officer Chen returned their papers, her gaze lingering on the trio with quiet respect. "Dr. Thompson," she said, "would you like to press charges for harassment? We've got multiple witnesses and video evidence." Michelle glanced at Patricia, who now sat on a bench near the police cruiser, her head in her hands. The woman's polished exterior had crumbled, leaving her exposed and diminished. "Yes," Michelle said firmly, her voice carrying a steely edge, "not just for us, but for every family that doesn't fit someone's narrow idea of what a family should be. This kind of thing has to stop." The crowd murmured in agreement, their voices weaving a tapestry of shared struggle stories of prejudice, of judgment, of resilience. A young mother with vibrant blue hair stepped forward, her hands clasped nervously. "Thank you for standing up," she said to Michelle, her voice trembling with emotion. "My wife and I are starting the adoption process, and seeing you handle this with such grace gives us hope." Michelle offered her a small, genuine smile, the connection between them a flicker of light in the fading day. As the police continued their work, the park's atmosphere shifted. What had begun as a clash of suspicion and hostility was blooming into a quiet celebration of unity. Emma, feeling secure again, slipped from David's arms and darted back to the sandbox, her laughter mingling with the chatter of other children who joined her. Their parents stood watch, a vigilant line against intolerance, their faces set with determination. In her patrol car, Officer Chen typed up her report, her fingers pausing as she glanced through the windshield at the Thompsons. David knelt beside Emma, helping her build a sandcastle, while Michelle leaned against him, her exhaustion tempered by relief. Chen's thoughts drifted to her own adoption journey's endless forms. The sleepless nights waiting for approval, the overwhelming joy of bringing her son home, and the occasional sting of strangers' ignorance. She understood Michelle's fight in a way that ran deeper than protocol. Across the park, Patricia sat in silence, her phone now bagged as evidence. Officer Thompson loomed nearby, her tone unwavering as she outlined the charges: false reporting, harassment, unauthorized recording. "These are serious matters, ma'am," she said. Her words a cold reminder of the line Patricia had crossed. The woman's face crumpled, her earlier arrogance replaced by a dawning realization of the consequences she'd invited. In that moment, Riverside Park became more than a playground. It became a crucible where justice was tested and reclaimed. Michelle and David stood together, their family unbroken, a testament to love's quiet strength. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the world in twilight, the lesson lingered in the air. Power misused could unravel even the proudest, while courage, rooted in truth, could lift a community to stand as one. The late afternoon sun dipped low over Riverside Park, casting long shadows across the sandbox where Emma shoveled dirt with a small plastic spade. Her tiny hands worked diligently, but her eyes flickered upward every few seconds, searching for the familiar figures of her parents perched on a weathered wooden bench nearby. Michelle and David sat close, their fingers intertwined, a quiet anchor amidst the storm that had just swept through their lives. Michelle's thumb brushed absent-mindedly over David's knuckles, her chest tight with a mix of relief and lingering unease. She'd always known the world could be unkind to families like theirs, adoptive, interracial, built from love rather than convention, but today had driven that truth home in a way she hadn't expected. David, ever the steady one, squeezed her hand a little tighter, his jaw set as he watched Emma play. He wanted to shield her from all of it, from the stares and whispers, from the weight of a stranger's judgment. Yet here they were, surrounded by a community that had rallied in a way neither of them could have predicted. Around the sandbox, other parents had instinctively formed a protective ring, their children laughing and tumbling together as if nothing had happened. The air buzzed with the carefree shrieks of play, but beneath it lay a current of solidarity, a shared understanding that something unjust had unfolded here. Mrs. Martinez, a weary woman with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense stride, approached Officer Rodriguez, her phone clutched tightly in her hand. Her voice trembled with indignation as she thrust the device toward him. "I've got more footage," she said, her words clipped and forceful. You can see it clear as day how she trailed them across the park, hovering like some vulture before she pounced. It wasn't just nosiness, it was harassment, plain and simple. She tapped the screen, replaying the shaky video she'd captured, Patricia Weber's rigid posture, her pointed finger jabbing the air as she confronted Michelle and David, her voice rising over Emma's confused whimpers. Mrs. Martinez's lips pressed into a thin line, her anger simmering just beneath her calm exterior. She'd lived in Pine Grove her whole life, raised her own kids in this park, and the thought of someone poisoning it with prejudice made her blood boil. Nearby, a lanky teenager shuffled back into the scene, his sneakers scuffing the grass. He'd spoken up earlier, casually mentioning his two moms when Patricia's tirade had veered into ugly territory. Now, he returned with the women themselves, two figures radiating warmth as they enveloped Michelle in a tight, wordless hug. Their eyes shone with empathy, a silent acknowledgement of the hurt they all understood too well. "We're from the Pine Grove LGBTQ+ family support group," one of them said, her voice soft but steady, her arm still resting lightly on Michelle's shoulder. "I'm Lisa, and this is Tara. We'd love for you and your family to come to one of our meetups. It's a place where people get it, where you don't have to explain yourself." Tara nodded, her gaze drifting to Emma with a gentle smile. "She's a tough little one. You've got something special there." Michelle managed a shaky laugh, her throat tight with emotion. The offer felt like a lifeline, a reminder that they weren't alone in this fight. Officer Chen emerged from her patrol car, her notepad tucked under her arm as she adjusted her cap. She moved with purpose, her boots crunching against the gravel path as she made her way toward Patricia first. The woman stood apart from the crowd, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, her once confident demeanor crumbling like dry leaves underfoot. Her fingers twisted nervously in front of her, betraying the storm raging inside. "Miss Weber," Officer Chen began, her tone firm but not unkind. "We need you to come with us to the station to finish your statement. I hope you realize that what happened here today wasn't just a mistake, it was illegal. And it hurt people. A little girl and her parents are dealing with the fallout of your actions." Patricia's eyes dropped to the ground, her breath hitching as the weight of her choices settled over her. She'd been so sure of herself earlier, so righteous in her conviction that she was protecting something: standards, tradition, whatever flimsy excuse she'd clung to. Now, as she glanced around at the other parents giving their statements, their voices steady and united in defense of the Thompsons, that certainty dissolved into a cold, hollow ache. She nodded mutely, her shoulders slumping as Officer Chen gestured toward the patrol car. Across the park, Officer Chen then turned her attention to the Thompsons, her expression softening as she approached. "Dr. Thompson," she said, her voice warm with genuine respect, "I want you to know we're handling this with the seriousness it deserves. As an adoptive mom myself, I get extra hurdles our families face. The way people sometimes look at us like we don't quite fit. You've got our support." Emma, who'd been quietly piling sand into a lopsided castle, tilted her head up at the officer, her wide eyes sparkling with curiosity. "You've got an adopted kid too?" she asked, her voice small but bright, a flicker of her usual cheer breaking through the day's shadows. Officer Chen grinned, crouching down to Emma's level and pulling out her phone. She swiped to a photo of a beaming boy with tousled hair, perched on a swing. "That's Tyler," she said. "He came to our family 2 years ago." Emma's face lit up, her smile stretching ear to ear. "Just like me, I joined my family 3 years ago." She spun toward Michelle and David, her excitement bubbling over. "Mommy, Daddy, can we have a playdate with Tyler, please?" The adults chuckled, a soft ripple of laughter that felt like a balm against the day's tension. Michelle brushed a tear from her cheek, her heart swelling at her daughter's unshakable spirit, how she could find a thread of joy even now. Mr. Johnson, a graying man with a weary frame and a restless border collie tugging at its leash, had been watching from the sidelines, his brow furrowed in thought. He stepped forward, clearing his throat to draw attention. "I'm on the neighborhood council," he said, his voice gruff but earnest. "We've got a meeting next week about community safety, and this needs to be on the agenda. We can't let it slide." His dog whined softly, nudging his leg, but he stood firm, his gaze sweeping over the gathered parents. Others chimed in, their ideas tumbling out in a rush. A young mother with a toddler on her hip suggested a Family Diversity Awareness Day. Right there in the park, her eyes bright with determination, a local teacher, Mr. Ellis, raised his hand, his voice steady as he offered to host workshops at the community center sessions about modern families, about breaking down the walls of ignorance that still lingered in places like Pine Grove. The air crackled with possibility, a collective resolve taking root. Officer Rodriguez joined Officer Chen near the sandbox, his clipboard heavy with statements. "We've got everything we need," he murmured, keeping his voice low. "Videos from multiple angles, witnesses lining up to talk, and a paper trail of harassment a mile long. It's airtight." The two exchanged a glance, a quiet satisfaction passing between them as they watched Patricia being led to the second patrol car. She moved slowly, her head bowed, all traces of her earlier bravado stripped away. Just before she ducked into the vehicle, she turned, her eyes locking onto the Thompson family one last time. Emma was back at play, her laughter ringing out as she tossed sand with another child, surrounded by a community that had woven a shield of acceptance around her. The sight pierced Patricia like a blade glove in all its messy, beautiful forms, thriving despite her efforts to tear it down. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her words frail and fleeting, swallowed by the breeze. The damage was done, but in that moment, a crack opened in the armor of her prejudice, a faint glimmer of understanding struggling to take hold. By Monday morning, the park incident had erupted across social media, a wildfire of outrage and solidarity blazing through Pine Grove's online spaces. The community's Facebook group buzzed with post-parents who'd been there uploaded their videos, each clip a damning portrait of Patricia's aggression and the Thompsons' quiet strength. Sarah Martinez's post stood out, her caption a rallying cry. "This isn't who we are. Watch how this woman targeted a local doctor and her daughter in our park. Stop the hate, families love." The video racked up thousands of views, shares spreading it far beyond the town's borders. Local news stations swooped in, reporters descending on Pine Grove Medical Center where Michelle worked as a pediatrician. Jana, her office manager, stood like a sentinel at the front desk, her arms crossed as she turned away crew after crew. "Dr. Thompson's with her patients," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. "She's not here for your sound bites inside." Michelle moved through her day with the calm focus that defined her, checking fevers and soothing worried parents, though her phone vibrated nonstop with messages of support, friends, neighbors, even strangers moved by her family's story. For Patricia, Monday brought a starkly different reality. At Luxury Homes Realty, where she'd built a career selling sprawling estates, her name had become a liability. Her face, unmistakable in the viral videos, sparked a flood of furious comments on the company's social media pages. By noon, the firm issued a statement, their words crisp and unequivocal. "We are aware of the disturbing incident involving one of our agents. This behavior does not align with our values of inclusivity and respect. Patricia Weber has been placed on administrative leave pending a full investigation." She sat alone in her office that morning, the silence deafening as her colleagues avoided her gaze, their whispers trailing her like shadows. At Emma's preschool, the teachers seized the moment to teach. Miss Clark gathered the children in a circle, her voice gentle as she read Love Makes a Family. The pages bright with illustrations of homes like theirs, diverse, vibrant, bound by care. "Families come in all kinds," she said, her eyes meeting Emma's. "What makes yours special?" A boy with a mop of curls piped up, "Emma's mommy is the best doctor. She gave me a Spider-Man Band-Aid when I fell." Other voices joined in, a chorus of small admirers. And Emma beamed, her pride a quiet glow. Across town, Rachel Chen, a fierce advocate in the Pine Grove Parents Association, launched an event page for a family diversity celebration at Riverside Park the next weekend. "Let's show what real family values look like," she wrote. "All are welcome. Mellots flood the park with love. Hundreds are SVPD within hours." A testament to the community's hunger for change, David's law firm stepped up too, issuing a statement of unwavering support and announcing free legal consultations. For families facing discrimination initiative, he'd lead himself. Local businesses followed suit, their windows blooming with signs, "All families welcome here and love makes a family." The ice cream parlor where Emma savored her strawberry cones hung a banner promising free scoops that weekend, a sweet gesture of solidarity. At the police station, officers Chen and Rodriguez finalized their report. The evidence overwhelming videos, statements, Patricia's own recorded call to dispatch with no basis but her bias. The DA's office was already circling, ready to press charges. That night, Michelle and David sat at their kitchen table, Emma tucked into bed upstairs. They scrolled through the outpouring of support, a flood of messages that left Michelle teary-eyed. One email, from a mother of a black daughter adopted into a white family, struck deep. "Your grace today gave me strength. You've lit a fire in our community." David showed her the local news headline, "Pine Grove Stands United," complete with photos of the signs popping up around town. As they climbed into bed, Emma's sleepy murmur drifted through the monitor, "My family is love." She sighed, clutching her teddy bear. It was everything they'd fought for, distilled into a child's truth. A week later, Patricia sat alone in her dim living room. A stack of legal papers sprawled across her coffee table. The police had charged her with filing a false report and harassment. Her real estate license hung in limbo. Park Karen, they called her online. Her face a meme of intolerance. She stared at the documents, her hands trembling as she traced the wreckage of her choices. Justice had found her, swift and unyielding, a lesson in the cost of wielding power without care. Across town, Pine Grove buzzed with plants playdates, workshops, a park brimming with families of every kind. What began as a wound had become a reckoning, a chance to heal and grow, proving that love, in all its forms, could outlast hate. The newspaper sat untouched on Patricia Weber's kitchen table, its bold headlines glaring up at her. Though she hadn't bothered to unfold it, she already knew the words it carried, her name splashed across the pages, tied to a story that had spiraled far beyond the quiet streets of Pine Grove. It had clawed its way into the national spotlight, and now her phone buzzed relentlessly, a swarm of notifications from her grown children piercing the silence of her home. Her daughter in Seattle had called earlier, her voice trembling through sobs, each word heavy with disbelief. "Mom, how could you do this? How could you let it come to this?" she'd pleaded, her tears crackling through the line. Patricia's son had texted too, his messages sharp and curt, laced with a fury she hadn't seen from him since his teenage years. She stared at the screen, her chest tight with a mix of shame and defiance, unable to type a reply. The weight of their horror pressed down on her, but she wasn't ready to face it, not yet. Across town, the Pine Grove Community Center buzzed with a different energy, alive with voices and the rustle of anticipation. The room was packed, every chair taken, people spilling into the easels, neighbors, reporters. Local officials all gathered under the soft glow of fluorescent lights. At the front, Michelle Thompson stood behind a podium, her posture steady, her dark hair catching the light as she surveyed the crowd. The wooden floor creaked beneath her feet, and the air smelled faintly of coffee and donated pastries from the bakery down the street. She adjusted the microphone, her fingers brushing against it with a quiet resolve, and began to speak. "What happened to my family in the park? It's not just our story," she said, her voice ringing out, clear and unwavering despite the tremor of emotion beneath it. "It's a story too many families live every day, but what sets us apart is your community. You didn't turn away, you stood with us. You showed that love doesn't come with a rule book or a single phase." Her words hung in the air, met with nods and murmurs of agreement from the crowd. In the front row, little Emma Thompson sat nestled between her father, David, and Mrs. Martinez, a neighbor whose warm smile had become a fixture in their lives since the incident. Emma's small hands clutched a picture book, about familiar pages filled with bright illustrations of parents and children, who didn't all look alike but loved each other just the same. She scribbled crayons across the paper, her tongue poking out in concentration, pausing now and then to glance up at her mother. With a quick wave and a grin, she went back to her coloring, her spirit unshaken, her recovery a testament to the flood of support that had carried them through. The park incident, a moment that could have broken her, had instead become a distant shadow, chased away by the kindness surrounding her now. Next to take the podium was Officer Sarah Chen, her police uniform crisp, her badge glinting under the lights. She stepped forward with a quiet authority, her dark eyes scanning the room before she spoke. "I wear the hats in this town," she began, her tone measured but warm. "I'm an officer sworn to protect, and I'm an adoptive mom, raising a son who doesn't share my blood but owns my heart. I've seen this issue from both sides: fear, the misunderstanding, the mistakes. What happened at the park, it's a wake-up call. We're not perfect, but we're learning. New trainings coming for every officer, family diversity, racial sensitivity, the works. I promise you, we won't let this happen again." The room erupted, applause crashing like a wave, hands clapping in rhythm as heads nodded in approval. Local businesses had pitched in, tables lining the walls laden with sandwiches, cookies, and pitchers of lemonade. Children's drawing stick figure families in every color of crayon fluttered on the walls, taped up with care, each one a small declaration that love didn't need to match. Back at her house, Patricia finally picked up her phone, her fingers hovering over the screen before opening her email. A new message waited from her therapist, confirming their next session, a court-ordered step after her arrest. The judge had been firm: diversity training, counseling, community service. At first, she'd bristled at the idea, her pride flaring up like a cornered animal. She'd sat through those early sessions with her arms crossed, her jaw tight, convinced she was the victim of an overblown misunderstanding. But now, after a week of sleepless nights and hard thoughts, something was shifting. She scrolled through her inbox and clicked a link someone had sent, an article about transracial adoption. For once, she didn't skim it with a sneer. She read slowly, letting the stories of families like the Thompsons sink in. She pictured Emma's wide, frightened eyes from that day in the park, the way they darted toward her parents for safety, and a pang of shame twisted in her gut. She lingered on the screen, the glow casting shadows across her face, wondering how she'd let herself fall so far. At the community center, the meeting rolled on. The podium a revolving stage for voices rarely heard. A lanky teenage boy with braces stood up, his voice cracking as he spoke about growing up with two momschow their love had built him a home, stronger than any judgment could tear down. A father followed, his broad shoulders squared with pride as he shared the journey of adopting his son from China, the red thread of fate tying them across oceans. Then came an elderly woman, her silver hair pulled back, her hands trembling slightly as she gripped the microphone. She told of being a black child raised by white parents in the 1960s, of the stares and whispers, but also the fierce devotion that held them together. Each story wove into the next, a tapestry of resilience and defiance against a world too quick to draw lines. David Thompson took his turn, his lawyer's poise blending with a father's tenderness. He adjusted his glasses, his voice steady but thick with feeling. As a lawyer, I fight for justice. It's my job to see right done. But as a father, I know justice isn't enough. We need understanding, growth, change. That's why my firm's launching a program to support families facing discrimination. Will help. Resources, a hand to hold when the system turns cold. The local news camera's word, capturing every word. Lisa Chen, a reporter with sharp eyes and a notepad full of scribbles, jotted down quotes for her feature, How One Family's Park Day Changed a Community. Her story would later earn a local journalism award, praise for its gentle yet unflinching look at Pine Grove's awakening. When the speeches ended, the room softened into smaller circles, families clustering together, swapping stories and phone numbers over cups of punch. The Pine Grove Family Diversity Support Group swelled by 50 new members that night, their first meeting already set for the park where it all began. They'd reclaim that patch of grass, turn a place of fear into one of laughter and belonging. Emma tugged at Michelle's sleeve, her voice bright with excitement. "Mommy, can we get ice cream? The shop has rainbow flags now." She pointed across the street to the parlor, its windows adorned with pride and ally banners fluttering in the breeze. Michelle smiled, her heart swelling as she took her daughter's hand. As they crossed the road, 3 different people stopped them: a shopkeeper, a jogger, an older man walking his dog, each one saying how the park incident had cracked open their eyes. Emma beamed up at them, her small voice proud. "My mommy and daddy picked me because of love," she said, and Michelle's throat tightened with gratitude. The day closed with a surprise from the mayor, his voice booming through the microphone. "Pine Grove's hosting its first Family Diversity Festival this spring," he announced, grinning as the crowd cheered. Michelle, Officer Chen, and a handful of advocates would lead the planning, a coalition of voices determined to keep the momentum alive. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in streaks of orange and pink, Pine Grove felt different and changed. One woman's prejudice had ignited something bigger, a ripple of compassion spreading outward. And in her quiet living room, Patricia Weber sat alone, the article still open on her phone, her mind wrestling with questions she'd never dared ask before. For the first time, she wondered what family truly meant. 3 months later, spring breathed new life into Pine Grove, Riverside Park, where the incident had unfolded, bloomed with wildflowers, their colors dancing in the breeze. The playground gleamed with fresh paint and ramps for wheelchairs, a sign near the entrance proclaiming all families welcome in bold, cheerful letters. On a bright Saturday morning, Michelle stood at the park's edge, her clipboard forgotten as she watched families stream in for the first Family Diversity Festival. Her chest swelled with pride. This was her dream made real. Booths dotted the paths, offering pamphlets on adoption, support group flyers, and handmade crafts from local kids. Laughter floated through the air, mingling with the smell of grilled food and sunscreen. Emma, now 6, darted ahead to the face painting station, her friend Tyler, Officer Chen's adopted son, racing beside her. They plopped down on the grass, giggling as the artist brushed rainbow hearts onto their cheeks. David trailed behind, his camera slung around his neck, snapping photos of their joy to tuck into the family album. Nearby, Mrs. Martinez and her teenage twins manned a food stall, their table piled high with tamales, egg rolls, and samosas, flavors from the worlds they'd woven into their lives. Mr. Johnson, a retired teacher with a golden retriever named Max, directed parking in a bright t-shirt that matched his dog's bandana. Love makes a family. The ice cream shop had rolled out a free Sunday bar, and the line snaked around the corner. Kids clutching cones dripping with chocolate and sprinkles. Near the community center's entrance, a woman lingered, clutching a folder to her chest. Patricia Weber looked different. Nowhere designer workout gear swap for a simple blouse and slacks. Her shoulders hunched with a humility she hadn't worn before. 3 months of counseling, training, and community service had chipped away at the walls she'd built. She'd asked to speak at the festival, a request the court had greenlit as part of her rehabilitation. Michelle spotted her and walked over, the grass soft under her sneakers. The last time they'd faced each other here, anger and fear had crackled between them. Now, Patricia seemed smaller, her eyes flickering with nerves. "Dr. Thompson," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "thank you for letting me be here." Her hands trembled as she gripped her speech notes. Michelle studied her for a moment, then nodded. "Everyone deserves a chance to grow," she said, her tone firm but not unkind. She'd seen Patricia's efforts, hours logged, the apologies written, and it had softened the edges of her resentment. The festival kicked off with the Pine Grove Elementary Choir, their voices rising in a sweet, uneven rendition of "What a Wonderful World." Children from every kind of family, adopted, blended, same-sex, single-parent, linked hands in a circle, swaying to the music. Emma and Tyler stood side by side, their rainbow hearts smudged but bright. When Patricia's turn came, she stepped to the microphone, her steps slow but deliberate. "3 months ago, I stood in this park and showed the worst of myself," she began, her voice shaking but growing steadier with each word. "I let ignorance and fear take the wheel. I hurt a familiar little girl who didn't deserve it. Through counseling, through listening, I've learned that family isn't about matching skin or a perfect mold. It's about love, about choosing each other, day after day." To the Thompsons, to every family I judged, "I'm so sorry." She stepped back, eyes glistening, and a single clap broke the silence. Then another, and another, until the park thundered with applause, not just for her words, but for the possibility of change they carried. The day unfolded with a rhythm of its own. The library set up a reading nook, volunteers sharing stories of families big and small, different and daring. Officer Chen and her team ran a workshop on safety and respect, their badges gleaming as they answered questions from earnest parents. David's firm offered free consultations, their tent buzzing with families seeking advice. Emma flitted between friends, kids from adoptive homes, multiracial clans, grandparent-led households. "Sure, my family is perfect" t-shirt, a badge of honor she'd designed in art class. As dusk settled, Michelle called everyone for a group photo. Hundreds gather, adaptive parents, mixed-race couples, single moms, same-sex dads, grandparents with grandkids, allies in every shadow, leasing biodegradable balloons into the twilight, each one tied with a note of hope. Patricia stood at the crowd's edge, hesitant, until Emma spotted her. "Come on," the girl called, waving her over with a grin. "You're part of our community now." Patricia blinked, then stepped forward, a tentative smile breaking through. That night, as Michelle tucked Emma into bed, her daughter's sleepy voice piped up, "Mommy, can we invite Miss Patricia to my birthday next month? She looked lonely, and you said everyone needs a chance to learn about love." Michelle hugged her tight, marveling at the grace in her small heart. What could have taught Emma bitterness had instead shown her mercy, healing, and the strength of a community that chose love over division. As she switched off the light, Michelle smiled. Their story, born in love, tested by prejudice, redeemed through forgiveness, had reshaped Pine Grove. Justice had sparked it, but compassion had finished it, proving that love, in all its wild, beautiful forms, was the truest measure of family.